Hey guys, tonight we're stepping deep into a winter that doesn't care about your down jacket, your heated car seats, or that extra blanket folded at the foot of your bed. When the forests froze and winds howled, Native Americans turned hollow trees into natural shelters. Let's step back in time to see how they survived icy winter nights. Imagine this. Snowflakes as sharp as glass shards whip at your face, and the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes clump together like tiny frozen brooms. You probably won't survive this without some serious ingenuity, and they had plenty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing where everyone's tucked in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a dense northern forest, each step crunching into the crusted snow with a crispness that echoes between the trees. The sky is washed in pale moonlight, and everything feels still, except for the occasional groan of tree trunks adjusting to the cold. Your breath pours out in little silver clouds, vanishing almost as quickly as they appear. Ahead of you, a faint trail winds between ancient giants, oaks, sycamores, cottonwoods, trees old enough to remember centuries of winters, storms, and human footsteps. Somewhere out here, long before your insulated boots and flashlight, families walked this same path. Not for adventure, not for a midnight stroll, they walked for survival. The forest wasn't just scenery, it was shelter, pantry, fortress, and storybook all at once. You imagine yourself in a world before houses with thick walls, before radiators or roaring fireplaces. A world where the bitter wind itself could kill if you didn't respect it. This is the world many indigenous peoples of North America navigated when winter tightened its grip. Some tribes built semi-subterranean lodges. Some relied on wigwams insulated with bark. Others migrated to milder regions. But among the less talked about, and yet astonishingly clever adaptations, was the practice of sleeping inside hollowed-out trees. Not dead logs, living giants. Massive trunks with internal cavities, shaped by age, lightning, fire, or human hands. You move deeper into the woods, feeling how the air shifts the farther you go. Away from open plains, the forest traps heat more efficiently. Snow piles against the base of trees, muting sound. It's almost unnervingly quiet. Your modern brain whispers that you're alone, but centuries ago this silence would have meant safety. Less wind, more insulation, fewer predators prowling through the drifts, and most importantly, trees big enough to house a body, or several. Here's the thing, many regions of North America, especially in the Northeast, Great Lakes, and along parts of the Pacific coast, once had forests with truly colossal trees. Redwoods, sycamores, oaks, and chestnuts. Trees that towered high and grew wide enough to make today's park trees look like saplings. Historical accounts from early European explorers often described two men on horseback riding side by side through a single trunk. That's not poetic exaggeration. These were living structures sculpted by time. One mainstream historical fact often tucked into old journals. In some eastern woodlands, sycamore trees could reach diameters of 12 to 14 feet, with hollow cores large enough to hold an entire family. Some early settlers even temporarily lived inside such hollows when traveling west. Indigenous groups knew these trees far more intimately. They didn't stumble upon them. They mapped them mentally, passed knowledge through generations, and understood exactly which trees offered the best winter refuge. But here's a quirky little tidbit. Hollow trees weren't just used for sleeping. Some were turned into impromptu smokehouses or storage caches. There are accounts of entire hunting parties keeping their supplies inside a hollow, returning days later to find their meat perfectly preserved by the cold and dryness. You picture a hollow trunk as a kind of multi-purpose Swiss Army shelter, sleeping pod, pantry, chimney, and sometimes even a ceremonial nook. Historians still argue whether these tree shelters were primarily emergency solutions during sudden winter storms, or if some groups used them more routinely as part of planned wintering strategies. Some evidence points to strategic site selection, suggesting long-term knowledge of specific trees used repeatedly over winters. Others argue it was more opportunistic. When caught in brutal weather mid-journey, you used what nature offered. Either way, the ingenuity is staggering. You stop beside a massive trunk, its base gnarled like clenched fists. A narrow opening, no wider than your shoulders, leads into darkness. If you lean in, you catch a whiff of something damp but earthy, like a cellar or the inside of a well-used cabin. This is where the story truly begins. The bark at the entrance is smoothed in places, as though many hands have brushed against it over time. Moss grows thickly around the edges, insulating the gaps. You slide your hand along the inner curve, feeling a surprising warmth. Not actual heat, but protection. A buffer from the brutal wind outside. This hollow wasn't carved overnight. Sometimes, natural fire scars, where lightning struck, or a low forest fire burned into the base, created the initial cavity. Over decades, insects, fungi, and time widened it. In some cases, people helped the process along with controlled burning, carefully scraping charred wood away layer by layer. Imagine spending days feeding a slow fire inside a trunk, constantly monitoring it so the tree doesn't die, but gradually hollowing a chamber that grows deeper and rounder. No chainsaws, no power drills, just patience, knowledge of how wood burns, and a keen sense of when to stop. You can almost hear the crackle of a careful fire licking the interior, sparks drifting upward like fireflies. The forest around you is an acoustic theatre. Wind hisses through leafless branches, an owl hoots distantly, and snow plops from high boughs in muffled thuds. But inside the hollow, the sound shifts. Your breathing becomes louder. The storm's roar dulls to a hum. It's like stepping into a pocket of time. Your flashlight beam skims over interior walls marked with soot and handprints. If you crouch, you can see where someone once pressed spruce boughs into the floor, probably to keep the cold from creeping up through the ground. Overhead, the hollow narrows to a chimney slit, just wide enough to vent smoke, but tight enough to keep warmth from escaping too fast. You feel it, the brilliant simplicity. A living structure already standing that needed only a few clever adjustments to become a refuge. As you lean back against the inner curve, snow begins to fall harder outside. The entrance frames the night like a small stage. You picture figures wrapped in fur robes, pulling their children close, bedding down against bark. Firelight flickers on their faces. Someone hums a lullaby, a melody you don't understand but can feel in your bones. For a brief, surreal moment, you realize you're in the same space that others once used to outlast freezing nights. The difference is, you can leave whenever you want. They couldn't. They depended on this hollow to keep breath in their lungs till morning. You reach down, scoop a handful of snow, and press it into the wall, watching it melt slower than you expected. The wood insulates not just from wind, but from temperature shifts. The heartwood still holds moisture, releasing it slowly into the air, keeping the inside from drying into a brittle freezer box. There's a kind of harmony between tree and human here, shelter without conquest. And so, as the night deepens and your mind drifts further into this wintry past, you take your first real breath inside a hollowed-out tree, letting the forest fold around you like a blanket. What began as a simple hook about surviving icy nights now feels personal, because you're no longer just observing. You're inside the story, surrounded by centuries of whispered survival. The trail ahead is faint, half buried beneath new snow, but once your eyes adjust to the moonlight and the subtle contours of the land, you start to see them. Depressions left long ago, softened over time, yet still marking a path like ghostly footsteps. You follow slowly, your boots sinking with each step, as if you're being led somewhere rather than wandering. The trees close in on both sides, tall silhouettes with limbs reaching upward like old storytellers gesturing at the stars. The cold nips your cheeks, making them tingle, but it's oddly invigorating, like the air itself is urging you forward. Somewhere under this snow, countless feet have pressed this same path into the earth. Hunters, families, children carrying bundles of dry moss, elders wrapped in layers of fur. They all walked this way when the world turned white. Winter didn't ask permission. It arrived suddenly, sometimes with a single night of bitter wind that stripped leaves from branches and froze river edges solid. You imagine waking up in a bark lodge to find the world transformed overnight into a silent, glittering expanse. There's a particular kind of hush that comes with winter forests, the kind that makes you aware of every crack, every breath, every distant sound. As you move along the path, you notice how the snow forms different textures around fallen branches and tree bases. Here it's packed tight, there it's a feathery dusting. This isn't random. People long before you read these subtle shifts as if they were letters on a page. A slightly raised ridge could mean a hidden root. A long trough leading toward thicker woods might reveal where others walked before, using the forest itself as both shelter and compass. Your modern eyes might call this tracking, but theirs was something deeper, a language of land that required no translation. You pause beneath an immense sycamore, its white mottled bark gleaming like bone in the moonlight. The trunk is so wide that if 3 of you joined hands, you might still not fully encircle it. These were the silent witnesses to entire seasons of movement. One historical journal from a 17th century explorer described paths beneath the giants, where natives passed as in corridors of a palace, the snow swept clean by their many treadings. That image sticks with you. Corridors, not wilderness. For them, this forest was not an unpredictable maze. It was home, mapped in memory rather than ink. Somewhere between 2 snow-laden ridges, you catch a glimpse of something curious. A notch carved into the bark of an old tree, no bigger than your palm. It's filled now with ice and time, but its shape is deliberate, like an arrow frozen mid-flight. These kinds of markings serve purposes you might not immediately guess. Sometimes they pointed toward known hollow trees used for shelter, almost like an ancient GPS system carved into living wood. In a landscape where landmarks shifted beneath blankets of snow, the trees themselves held the signs. And here's a little detail that might make you smile. Some oral traditions mention that certain trees were given nicknames, even personalities. A sycamore with a long scar from a lightning strike might be called the One-Eyed Guardian, while a massive red oak leaning just so could be Old Uncle Waiting. These names weren't frivolous. They were part of oral maps. If someone said, "Travel past Old Uncle Waiting and turn where the One-Eyed Guardian watches," you could find your way even in whiteout conditions. You picture a group trudging through a storm, repeating these names like soft incantations to keep their bearings, and perhaps their courage, intact. You keep walking, and the path gently curves toward a small rise. At the top, you can see further. The forest rolls like a frozen sea, the moonlight painting everything in silvery tones. Somewhere in that expanse were families moving with purpose, stopping at known hollow trees when the sun dipped too low and the air turned sharp as knives. Not every journey was a migration. Sometimes they were seasonal loops, patterned movements repeated generation after generation. And that's where a quiet debate among historians stirs. Some argue that these winter paths were spontaneous, formed anew each season as people adapted to snowpack and animal movements. Others insist the routes were structured, almost like ancient highways through the woods, passed down with precision. Neither side has absolute proof. The forest keeps its secrets well. But as you stand here, looking at the subtle line of the trail, you sense intention. This isn't random wandering. The snow deepens as you descend into a hollow between hills. Here the air is noticeably stiller, protected from the biting wind by the natural bowl of the land. You pull your coat tighter, imagining how people centuries ago would have read this place instantly. A good place to pause, maybe light a small, carefully hidden fire, maybe listen for the distant crack of trees splitting in the cold. They had no lanterns, no reflective markers, only memory, stars, and signs etched into the landscape itself. The trail bends once more, narrowing between 2 leaning trunks. Beyond them, you catch sight of a darker patch of forest where the trees grow closer together. It's quieter here, almost reverent. If the first section was your arrival at the edge of history, this feels like stepping fully inside it. Every step sinks you deeper into their world, where survival depended on knowing not just where you were, but where the trees waited with hollow hearts warm enough to keep you alive. The forest around you grows denser, the trees standing like an army of silent giants, their trunks thick enough to make you feel small in a way that modern buildings never quite manage. You brush past a low-hanging branch, its frost-dusted tips sprinkling a few crystals onto your hood, and ahead, the faint path widens into a small clearing. Here, surrounded by these towering figures, the air feels heavier, quieter, almost expectant. This is where choice mattered. For anyone seeking to survive a winter night out here, not every tree was a good shelter. Some were too narrow, others too damp, some angled awkwardly so that the wind would whistle through at night, like a ghost determined to keep you awake. Selecting the right tree was both science and instinct, learned through generations of trial, error, and memory. You walk toward a massive sycamore at the edge of the clearing, its bark pale and peeling in patchwork layers. Up close, the trunk is enormous, its base spreading like the foot of a cathedral column. Standing before it, You can almost hear the hushed deliberations of a family arriving here centuries ago, snow clinging to their cloaks, assessing whether this particular tree would cradle them through the night, or send them shivering toward the next. It wasn't just size that mattered. Shape, direction, and health were everything. A tree hollow tilted toward prevailing winds could become an icy wind tunnel. One with rot in the wrong place could collapse when fire warmed its insides. It's easy to romanticize the idea of sleeping in a hollow tree, but in reality, it was a calculated decision between life and death. There's an old story told among some northeastern woodland communities about the trees that breathe warmth. It's not mystical, though it sounds that way. It's about how living trunks, especially massive sycamores, retained internal warmth better than dead logs. The living tree's moisture and slow respiration created a more stable internal temperature, while dead, dried-out trunks could grow brittle and cold as stone. The trick was finding the giants that had hollow hearts but living crowns. That balance made them perfect shelters. Some of these trees had stood for hundreds of years, their cores slowly hollowed by time, while their outer shells remained strong, like ancient guardians offering their ribs for warmth. You circle the sycamore slowly, noting how its hollow entrance faces slightly southeast. That matters. Positioning an opening away from the harshest northern winds gave the best chance of retaining warmth through the night. Many indigenous groups developed keen senses for this. They didn't use compasses. They watched the way moss grew, how prevailing winds carved drifts against trunks, how branches leaned in response to centuries of storms. A person raised in this environment could walk into a grove like this and within minutes decide which tree was right. You, on the other hand, would probably pick the first one that looks Instagrammable and freeze halfway through the night. In your flashlight's glow, you notice subtle charring near the base of this trunk, ancient fire scars. Some trees were deliberately scorched at their bases over time to enlarge the natural hollows. Families or hunting parties would return season after season, each time burning a little more, shaping the cavity into something more habitable without killing the tree itself. There's something poetic about it. Not domination, but slow collaboration between human hands and a living being. A quirky little detail passed down in a few oral traditions tells of certain trees being tested by a knock. The story goes that if you struck the trunk with a stick, and the echo had a deep, mellow sound, the hollow inside was strong and resonant, safe. But if the sound rang thin or rattling, something inside was unstable, maybe rotten. It's half practical, half ritual. Choosing your winter shelter with your ears as much as your eyes. You imagine standing here in the dark, tapping on trunks like a wintertime drummer, listening for which one hums back with safety. The clearing holds several giants, each with different shapes. One has a hollow big enough for 2 people, but faces directly into the prevailing wind. Another has a narrower cavity, but a thick moss skirt at its base that could block drafts. There's no universal answer here, and that's where scholars have long argued. Were these shelter choices purely pragmatic? Or did cultural and spiritual considerations play just as big a role? Some researchers believe the direction a tree faced, or the type of tree chosen, held spiritual meaning as well as practical value, certain species being tied to particular clans or winter rituals. Others argue that survival trumped symbolism. When your fingers are turning numb and your breath is crystallizing midair, you pick the tree that keeps you alive, not the one that aligns with ceremony. The truth, as usual, probably lies in a quiet middle ground, where practicality and belief intertwined seamlessly. You crouch at the hollow entrance of the chosen tree, running your glove along the edges. Inside, it's dry, protected, and surprisingly still. Even with no fire, the wind outside feels muted here. You can almost picture the process. Arriving before nightfall, clearing out the interior of damp leaves, laying down pine boughs for insulation, maybe hanging hides over the entrance to block gusts. Families must have had practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role. Someone tending the embers, another setting bedding, children gathering moss from the nearby rocks to stuff into cracks. A well-chosen tree could turn from a cold cavity into a snug chamber in less than an hour. Overhead, a branch creaks as a gust passes through the canopy. Snow drifts gently from above, collecting at your feet. You step inside fully, letting the natural curve of the trunk envelop you. The air inside carries that same earthy dampness you noticed before, but it's not unpleasant. It smells like old wood and quiet endurance. This tree has weathered centuries of storms, One more night with you tucked inside barely registers. Out in the distance, a night bird calls, sharp and brief. The forest answers only with silence. You realize that here, choice isn't just about picking shelter. It's about reading a living world that speaks in signs you've mostly forgotten how to hear. The people who walked this path before you didn't just survive winters. They did it with a kind of elegant understanding of their surroundings, choosing trees like seasoned architects, selecting the perfect foundation for a house. Except their house was already standing, centuries old, waiting for them. You kneel beside the hollow tree, your gloves brushing against the rough bark, and suddenly you notice something. The way the bark feels warmer than the air. Not hot, of course, but faintly alive, like the skin of some slumbering creature. In this frigid wilderness, details like that mattered. Once the right tree was found, the next step was measuring, not with rulers or tape, but with practiced eyes, hands, and instincts sharpened by winters that never forgave hesitation. You press your palm against the bark, imagining how generations before you did the same, reading the tree's size and shape as fluently as you might read a text message. Standing inside, you stretch your arms outward. The interior isn't huge. You could touch both sides with fingertips if you tried, but there's a kind of intimate spaciousness to it. Indigenous winter travelers didn't stumble blindly into any cavity. They assessed each hollow like seasoned builders, inspecting a home. A tree too narrow meant bodies would be crammed in so tightly that breathing became uncomfortable. Too wide and you'd lose precious warmth. The sweet spot, according to descriptions from early European observers, was usually between 4 and 8 feet across, enough for a small group to curl together on a bed of spruce boughs without losing the trapped heat to empty space. You imagine them crouched inside, shoulders brushing, sharing body warmth and quiet stories as the world outside froze solid. The process of sizing wasn't just about diameter. Height mattered too. A low ceiling allowed heat to pool where people slept, while taller cavities acted like chimneys, drawing warmth upward and letting it escape. The trick was to find a tree whose hollow rose just high enough to stand or sit comfortably, but not so high that it turned into a heat siphon. You tilt your head upward and notice how the hollow narrows gently toward the top, perfect for holding warmth close to the ground. No measuring tools, just generations of accumulated wisdom, pressed into gestures and glances. One of the quirkiest practices whispered, through some oral accounts involved, what you might call a body measure ritual. A traveler would lie down at the tree's base and stretch their arms wide, sometimes even rolling a little, to judge if the cavity could fit their group snugly. Some say people would even bring in their bundled gear first, stack it at the back of the hollow, and then fit themselves around it like a puzzle, ensuring no wasted corners where cold air could gather. It's almost comical to picture. A group shuffling, lying down, wiggling against bark to test fit, the way campers today wrestle with tents and sleeping bags. But out here, that moment of awkward positioning could be the difference between a comfortable night and a dangerously cold one. As you trace the curve of the wall with your fingers, a thought stirs. Scholars have long debated whether the precision in these choices was entirely intuitive, or if some communities had more formalized systems, rules passed down about ideal measurements and orientations. Some researchers argue that such systems must have existed. The consistency described in early historical records suggests shared methods rather than purely personal guesswork. Others believe these skills were learned through lived experience, honed individually within families, rather than codified. The forest, after all, was teacher enough. Either way, what you're touching isn't random shelter. It's architecture without blueprints. You crouch lower and look at the floor. It's uneven, coated in a thin layer of ice where snow must have blown in over time. But in the past, this wouldn't have stayed icy for long. Travelers often laid down layers of pine or spruce boughs to create insulation between the ground and their bodies. Some communities favored cedar because of its pleasant smell and natural insect-repelling properties. Imagine the scent of crushed evergreen needles rising as you prepare the space, sharp and clean in the cold night air. That smell alone might have been comforting, a reminder that even in the heart of winter, the forest gave gifts. You shift slightly and the tree groans softly, a long, low sound that vibrates through your back like distant thunder. It's the kind of sound that would have been familiar to anyone sheltering here centuries ago. Wood contracting, wind brushing against the outer bark, snow settling above. Inside, those noises weren't frightening. They were part of the rhythm of winter nights. The hollow became an extension of the body, creaking and breathing with you. Choosing the right tree meant knowing how those sounds behaved, whether they hinted at weakness or simply at the tree's natural music. Measuring didn't end at the entrance. The opening itself was crucial. A gap too wide let in freezing gusts. Too narrow made getting in and out awkward, especially in emergencies. Many hollows were partially closed off with hides or bark slabs at night, leaving only a small gap for ventilation. Some accounts even describe snow being piled strategically around the base to block drafts, turning the entrance into a small, low tunnel that trapped warmth inside. You can picture someone crouching at night, carefully packing snow against bark like an ancient mason sealing their winter refuge. You stretch out one hand, palm pressed flat against the interior, and close your eyes for a moment. The cold of the outside fades a little. Here, surrounded by living wood, the temperature holds steady, buffered from the wind's vicious bite. You imagine a family kneeling just as you are, deciding, yes, this one will do. There's something profoundly human in that moment. The shared understanding of space, safety, and warmth without needing a single word. As you step back into the clearing, snowflakes swirl around you again, stinging lightly against your face. The forest feels less like a tangle of trees now, and more like a gallery of shelters, waiting for the right hands to read them. This wasn't guesswork. It was careful, deliberate preparation, passed down like an unspoken map through generations. You glance back at the hollow entrance, its shadow dark and inviting, and think about how measuring a tree once meant measuring your chance at surviving the night. The wind picks up as you make your way deeper into the woods, brushing past bare branches that rattle softly like old bones knocking together. Your breath comes out in white plumes, drifting into the cold night air and vanishing almost instantly. You glance back at the hollow tree you measured before. It stands silently, like a chosen refuge waiting to be transformed. But before anyone could sleep inside one of these giants, the interior often had to be prepared. And that meant carving, hollowing, shaping. Without the hum of power tools, without steel blades, without the luxury of time wasted. You kneel at the base of another tree, one whose hollow is just beginning to form. A charred cavity, blackened and rough, smelling faintly of old smoke. You run your fingers along the inside and feel where fire once licked away the heartwood, leaving smooth curves in some places and jagged ridges in others. In the past, indigenous families and hunting parties often used controlled fire to expand natural hollows. They would set a small, carefully monitored fire inside the trunk, feeding it just enough to burn the interior without killing the tree. Then, once the flames had done their work, they'd scrape away the charred wood with stone tools, sharpened adzes, bone chisels, or even sturdy bits of antler, creating smooth inner walls. Over seasons, sometimes years, these hollows could be coaxed into perfect sleeping chambers. You can almost see the scene. A group gathered at dusk, one person tending a small fire at the base of the trunk, while another keeps a close eye on the bark outside, ready to douse stray sparks. Someone else kneels nearby with a wet hide, pressing it against areas where the flames might spread too far. This was delicate work. Too much heat and the tree would split or die. Too little, and the hollow would remain cramped. Fire was both sculptor and threat, requiring patience and absolute focus. The hollowing wasn't rushed. It was returned to season after season, shaped like a living project. And here's a strange little detail that has lingered in a few stories. Sometimes, while the fire was burning inside the tree, people would place specific herbs or mosses onto the embers, not just to control the flame, but to sweeten the air. Some of these plants gave off soothing aromas when smoldering, masking the harsher smell of burning wood and leaving the interior perfumed in a way that made the hollow feel more like a home. You imagine the scent of cedar, sweetgrass, or crushed spruce rising from the darkness, mingling with the crisp winter air outside. It's not something you'd expect from what is essentially a tree-sized oven in the woods. But then again, survival and comfort often intertwined in quiet, human ways. You pick up a shard of ice and tap it against the charred wall. The sound echoes dully inside, like knocking on the door of a cave. Historians have often marveled at how such shaping was accomplished with what might seem like primitive tools. But in truth, these communities understood wood behavior intimately. Certain species like sycamore and cottonwood burned evenly and hollowed cleanly, while others resisted or cracked unpredictably. Choosing the right tree wasn't enough. You had to know how to persuade it to open up. Over time, these hollows didn't just happen. They were crafted through fire, muscle, and a kind of collaboration with the living forest. You imagine working in the dead of winter, crouched by firelight, slowly scraping away blackened wood while snow falls outside. The cold bites at your fingers, but the glow inside the trunk is warm, flickering across faces and bark. This is the part of the story modern eyes often miss. These shelters weren't accidental. They were the result of deliberate, skilled labor passed through generations. Children watched their parents shape these hollows, learned how to tend the fire without scorching the bark, memorized which woods sang when burned and which cracked apart. It wasn't just shelter building, it was inheritance. Scholars have long debated the scale of this practice. Some argue that most tree hollows were natural, used opportunistically rather than created intentionally. They point to the prevalence of lightning strikes and fungal decay in old-growth forests, claiming that human intervention was occasional at best. Others insist that the evidence of controlled burning patterns on certain surviving trees shows deliberate modification. The neatness of some cavities, the presence of tool marks, the way openings were often oriented just so. These don't look like coincidences. Standing here, looking at this blackened, smoothed interior, it's hard not to lean toward the latter view. The craftsmanship is too elegant to be purely accidental. You reach into the cavity and pull your hand back, dusted with fine black soot. It stains your gloves instantly. For a moment, you think about how many hands must have been blackened the same way over centuries. Parents, elders, travelers, hunters, all shaping their winter refuge the same way, in quiet cooperation with the trees that towered over them. There's something timeless in the simplicity of it. Fire, wood, hands, patience. No blueprints, no nails, no hinges. Just living architecture coaxed gently from within. As the wind outside moans through the branches, you step back and look at the tree again. Its hollow seems larger now. Not because it has changed, but because you can imagine the process that made it. You picture the glow of a tiny flame deep inside, the sound of scraping echoing in the cold night, and the way the forest must have smelled when smoke rose softly against falling snow. This was engineering at its most elemental. Fire against wood, guided by human instinct and need. The night grows colder, your breath sharper, but something about this part of the story lingers with warmth. It's easy to romanticize, but if you were here centuries ago, this would have been exhausting work, necessary and precise. By the time the fire was out and the walls scraped clean, hands would ache, smoke would cling to hair and clothes, and yet, what remained was a sanctuary strong enough to face the worst of winter. You run your palm over the charred surface one last time, feeling the faint ridges left by scraping tools long turned to dust, and step back into the snow, carrying their quiet craftsmanship with you. You crouch at the entrance of the tree hollow as twilight deepens into a heavy, starless night. The air sharpens with every breath, your nostrils prickling from the cold. Snow drifts softly through the forest, gathering on your shoulders in a quiet, relentless way, like time itself piling up. Inside the hollow, darkness pools thick and heavy, waiting for something to wake it. This is where fire enters. Not as a roaring bonfire, but as a careful, deliberate guest. Lighting a flame inside a living tree was never done casually. It required control, patience, and a deep understanding of how heat and smoke behaved in confined spaces. One careless spark, and a life-saving shelter could turn into a chimney of death. You kneel and strike flint against steel, the tiny shower of sparks catching on the dry moss and bark scrapings you've arranged. The faint glow illuminates the interior walls, just enough to see your breath swirl in the dim light. Historically, fires built inside these hollows were small, just enough to create embers and warmth, not the leaping flames you might associate with campfires. Many indigenous winter travelers carried coals wrapped in bark bundles, tucked away and kept alive during journeys, so that fire could be rekindled quickly without wasting precious tinder. You picture a traveler arriving at a hollow tree after miles of trudging through snow, kneeling inside, unwrapping that bundle like a secret, and blowing gently until the coals flare to life. In the dead of winter, a glowing ember wasn't just warmth, it was continuity, proof that yesterday's fire was still walking beside you. As your little flame grows, it sends smoke curling upward in thin ribbons. It snakes toward the narrow chimney opening above, a slit in the tree that acts like a natural vent. You watch carefully, testing how the smoke behaves. If the opening is too tight, the hollow fills with haze, stinging your eyes. too wide and the heat escapes too quickly. Some families were known to adjust these vents seasonally, gently widening or narrowing them using heated sticks, almost like tuning an instrument. It's an image that sticks with you. People working by firelight, adjusting the breadth of their shelter to strike that perfect balance between warmth and air. And here's something unexpectedly charming. You've heard stories of children in some communities who used to play with the smoke that rose inside these hollows. They'd blow at it, wave their hands, pretend the drifting tendrils were forest spirits slipping out into the night. Sometimes they even told little riddles into the smoke, believing that if the smoke rose straight, the spirits were pleased, and if it swirled back down, someone had left a door flap open or arranged the fire poorly. Imagine growing up where smoke isn't just something to cough at. It's part of the nightly ritual, a messenger between people and the world outside. The hollow gradually warms, a soft, slow heat that doesn't rush but settles in like a heavy blanket. The inside walls, slightly damp from the living tree, absorb some of the heat and release it back gradually. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the subtle exchange between fire and wood, like two old friends in quiet conversation. It's not blazing warmth, but it's enough to make fingers supple again, to drive the deep chill out of bones. Travelers who knew what they were doing could keep a single ember bed glowing all night long, feeding it occasionally with small twigs or bits of bark peeled from nearby branches. They didn't waste wood on huge flames. Everything was measured, efficient, sustainable. This kind of fire use has long fascinated historians. Some argue that the practice of lighting interior fires in living trees was rare, used only in emergencies when other shelter options were unavailable. They believe most hollows were left unheated, relying on insulation and shared body warmth. Others point to multiple early colonial accounts describing thin columns of smoke rising from tree trunks on cold mornings, implying regular and skilled use of fire inside these spaces. The debate hinges partly on evidence. Charred inner walls and soot layers have been found in some ancient hollow trees, suggesting long-term use, but how widespread it was remains uncertain. As the embers crackle softly beneath your hands, the idea of not using fire at all in such a frigid night feels almost unimaginable. The smoke swirls for a moment before catching the upward draft through the chimney. Outside, the wind howls faintly, but in here the sound is muffled, distant. The orange glow paints the interior in warm tones, flickering across the curved walls like a primitive lantern. You imagine families huddled here centuries ago, faces half lit, shadows stretching upward. Maybe someone sings softly to keep the night at bay, or an elder tells a story while children trace shapes in the soot with curious fingers. The hollow is transformed, no longer just a cavity in a tree, but a small, breathing hearth in the middle of the forest. You lean closer to the fire, feeling its gentle pulse against your palms. There's something deeply human about this moment. It's not the scale of the fire that matters, but the act itself. The careful tending, the deliberate placement of each ember, the way it threads the fragile line between comfort and danger. A fire too big could split the trunk, send sparks flying upward. Too small, and everyone inside would shiver through the night. Finding that balance was an art passed through generations, one that relied more on senses than instructions. As the flames settle into glowing coals, you sit back against the curved wall of the hollow. The warmth seeps slowly into your back. The smoke drifts lazily above your head, and outside, the forest grows quieter. This isn't the crackle of a grand campfire. It's the heartbeat of survival, tucked away inside living wood. You look up through the chimney slit and catch a glimpse of a single snowflake drifting down, melting as it hits the warm air rising. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snaps under the weight of ice. But here, inside this hollowed trunk, you're wrapped in a quiet cocoon of heat and shadow, just as people once were hundreds of winters ago. The ember bed hums softly behind you as you step outside for a moment, letting the cold night air bite your cheeks. The forest is hushed, holding its breath beneath a thick quilt of snow. Above, the sky has cleared, revealing a scatter of stars so sharp they look like someone pressed a blade through velvet. You turn back toward the tree and notice how the entrance, though simple, frames the glowing interior like the doorway of some hidden woodland home. But for all its beauty, a hollow alone wasn't enough. To truly survive the long winter nights, these shelters had to be modified, lined, insulated, reinforced, turned from rough cavities into snug, carefully engineered nests. You kneel just inside the entrance, running your fingers along the inner wall. It's cool to the touch, but not icy, thanks to the living tree's subtle warmth. Indigenous families often layered the interior with bark sheets peeled from other trees, usually birch, cedar, or sometimes poplar, depending on what the forest offered. Birch was especially favored in many regions for its smooth texture and resistance to moisture. Historical observers often wrote with surprise about how, in the dead of winter, some hollow trees were lined almost entirely in pale birch bark, giving their interiors a bright, reflective quality that made a small ember fire feel warmer and more luminous. You picture someone carefully pressing strips of bark against the inner walls, tucking them between natural curves like fitting wallpaper in a place where no ruler existed. The floor, too, transformed. You can still see faint impressions in the packed earth where boughs might have once been laid. People would gather spruce, cedar, or pine branches, layering them thick to create an insulating mat between their bodies and the frozen ground. Some oral histories describe a particular rhythm to laying these boughs, overlapping like shingles on a roof to prevent cold drafts from sneaking up through gaps. If the forest offered it, moss was added next, pressed into crevices to make everything soft and airtight. Once settled on these layers, wrapped in furs or woven blankets, the cold beneath ceased to creep upward, leaving only the slow, gentle warmth of breath and ember. And here's a surprisingly charming detail. In some communities, families would hang small pouches of crushed herbs or pine resin from the hollow ceiling to freshen the air and keep insects away. Even in the depths of winter, with snow piled thick outside, they valued a pleasant interior. Some would chew spruce gum and stick it on bark like makeshift hooks to hang small belongings. A wintertime version of interior decorating. It's such a human touch. Surviving a freezing wilderness, but still taking a moment to make your temporary home smell nice and feel organized. You step further inside and crouch by the base of the walls, imagining how the structure was improved season after season. Some families returned to the same hollow trees every winter, adding layers of bark insulation each year until the interior became smooth, almost polished. Others used these shelters temporarily while moving between winter camps, stripping the insulation when they left so the tree could breathe through the warmer months. Scholars have long argued about this seasonal use. Some believe certain hollows were claimed and maintained by specific families or clans, almost like inherited cabins, revisited annually with care. Others suggest that most were opportunistic, used when needed, abandoned when not, with no formal ownership. The truth likely varied from region to region, shaped by local customs and forest abundance. The fire crackles softly, sending shadows dancing along the bark walls. You imagine the process of sealing up the entrance on a bitterly cold night, leaning slabs of bark or wood against the opening, leaving only a small gap for ventilation. In especially harsh storms, snow itself became part of the architecture, packed tightly around the base of the tree to block drafts. The result was a structure that didn't fight the winter, but collaborated with it. The tree's thick trunk held out the wind, the bark linings trapped warmth. The snow sealed everything like natural mortar. You sit down on the cold ground and close your eyes for a moment, letting your mind paint the interior as it would have looked then. The bark walls gleam faintly in the firelight. Boughs cushion the floor, soft and springy beneath woven blankets. The air smells faintly of resin and smoke. Outside, the wind rattles branches, but inside, there's a calm. A little pocket of human intention, carved out within the vastness of the forest. You run your fingers along the interior curve again, and think about the ingenuity at play here. There's no hammer, no nail, no insulation foam, just wood, bark, moss, snow, and the deep knowledge of how to fit them together so that winter stays outside. It's easy to forget how well people once understood their landscapes, how they turned raw materials into elegant solutions without ever calling it engineering. A gust of wind sweeps past the entrance, scattering a little snow into the hollow, and you instinctively brush it away, as if you were the night's caretaker. You imagine a family doing the same, tucking children into fur wraps, patting down loose moss, adjusting the entrance cover before settling in. Maybe a dog curls near the fire, its breath joining theirs in slow, rhythmic clouds. Maybe an elder sits quietly, listening to the forest, while younger ones rearrange the boughs to make the space just right. The hollow is no longer just a shelter now. It's a crafted, living chamber, The bark walls are its insulation, the moss its cushions, the snow its seal. Standing inside, you can feel how the tree, the people, and the winter itself weave together, each playing a role in the night's survival. It's not a structure imposed on the land, it's one grown from it. Night descends fully, wrapping the forest in a stillness so complete that even the smallest sounds seem amplified. The soft hiss of snow landing on branches, the distant crack of a tree settling under its icy burden. Everything carries through the cold air like whispers in a quiet room. You settle back into the hollow, feeling the insulation you imagined earlier now come to life around you. The fire's glow has dimmed to a deep orange bed of coals, steady and dependable, casting a warm halo on the bark walls. This is the hour when preparation gives way to ritual, when survival turns into rhythm, and rhythm turns into comfort. You imagine a family entering at dusk, their bodies shaking off the cold, each person falling into well-practiced roles without needing a word. Someone checks the ember bed, another adjusts the bark flap at the entrance. Children untie bundles of dry moss and spruce, spreading them on the floor like tiny homemakers. Among many native communities, evening routines were woven tightly into survival, but they were also moments of quiet connection. Food might be brought out, a pouch of dried venison or berries warmed by the embers, shared slowly, deliberately, in that glowing half-darkness. Even in a shelter carved from living wood, mealtime was more than necessity. It was a ceremony of warmth after the punishing cold outside. You lean your head back against the inner curve of the tree and close your eyes for a moment. The hollow seems to breathe with you. The temperature has risen enough that your fingers no longer sting, and you can feel warmth collecting in the air just above the floor. Many accounts from early European explorers noted their surprise at how warm the interiors of these tree shelters could become. One French missionary in the 1600s described stumbling upon what he thought was a chimneyless hut in the middle of the woods, only to realize, as he approached, that the smoke rose from the trunk itself. When he entered, he found 5 souls sitting inside the belly of a tree, their fire no larger than a hat, and yet the place was warm as a baker's oven. You can almost hear the disbelief in his voice. To someone unused to this practice, it must have felt like stumbling into a secret world. Not every part of the evening was solemn or quiet. There's a delightful image tucked into some oral stories. Children making shadow shapes on the inner bark with their hands, giggling softly as the flickering firelight turned their fingers into birds, deer, or spirits. Imagine lying there as a child, safe inside a tree while the wind screamed outside. Your world reduced to the warm curve of bark and the magical theatre of shadows overhead. The forest became both a shelter and a stage. It's such a tender, almost playful image, a reminder that even in harsh winters, life didn't stop at survival. It kept its moments of joy. Scholars have often discussed whether these nighttime rituals were purely pragmatic or if they carried spiritual weight. Some argue that the routines, lighting the fire in a certain way, arranging sleeping places methodically, sharing food quietly, were simply efficient habits born of necessity. Others see deeper patterns, suggesting these acts held ritual significance, binding families not just to each other, but to the living tree they sheltered in. After all, in many indigenous worldviews, trees weren't inert objects. They were living relatives. Sleeping inside one wasn't a casual act. It carried a kind of reverence, spoken or not. Perhaps it was both, practical and sacred, interwoven so tightly that separating the two misses the point. You shuffle closer to the imaginary ember bed, feeling how the interior's warmth is strongest near the ground. That's where people would gather, sitting cross-legged or reclining against the inner walls. The tree curved like a bowl, naturally held in the heat. There's a rhythm to the way the night unfolds in such a space. First comes the bustle of preparation, then the quiet of shared food and whispered conversation, and finally the slow drifting into rest one by one, until only the embers and the night watch remain. You picture the firelight catching on small personal items hanging from the walls, a pouch of herbs, a carved bone ornament, maybe a strip of sinew holding a child's toy. Little things brought inside not just to survive, but to make the space familiar. It strikes you how similar this is to the way modern people personalize their rooms with small, comforting objects. Photos, books, trinkets. The instinct is timeless. Outside, the wind sharpens again, howling faintly through the treetops. But inside, the sound is distant, like waves against a far shore. The entrance flap rustles softly, but the heat holds steady. The routines of the night have done their work. It's remarkable to think that with nothing but bark, moss, snow, and shared knowledge, people created spaces where cold could not intrude. This was not luxury. It was resilience crafted through daily ritual. Someone stirs the embers gently with a stick, releasing a small puff of sparks that swirl upward toward the chimney slit. The smell of warm wood smoke and resin fills the hollow, comforting in its simplicity. You can almost hear the soft murmur of a parent telling a story, their voice low and rhythmic, blending with the crackle of the fire. Maybe it's a tale of the first winter, or a trickster spirit, or a lesson hidden in a myth. Words in the dark, meant to keep minds warm while the body rests. The night rituals inside these trees weren't grand performances. They were quiet, methodical acts, stitched together by necessity, memory, and love. You feel it now, sitting here in the imagined warmth. This is how people made the cold less cruel. Not by conquering it, but by meeting it with grace, preparation, and shared rhythm. And as you lean back fully against the bark, the hollow cradles you like a great wooden womb, ancient and patient. As the forest sighs outside, the night deepens, and with it, the hollow takes on a new character. The fire has burned down to a gentle glow, and the air inside is no longer cold, but thick with a kind of living stillness. You shift slightly, feeling the warmth that has gathered near the floor cling to your legs like a soft animal. In this darkened cocoon, the tree itself seems to breathe. You can hear faint creaks within its trunk, like old bones settling, and every so often a soft groan travels upward, disappearing into the star-flecked sky through the narrow chimney slit. This is the breath of the tree, the quiet exchange of air, heat, and moisture that makes this shelter work through the night. Many who slept in hollow trees knew this intimately. Living trees don't just trap heat, they regulate it. The moisture within their heartwood slowly evaporates as the ember bed warms the air, creating a subtle humidity that prevents the inside from becoming unbearably dry. When you inhale, the air carries a faint, earthy scent. Moss, sap, old smoke. A combination that's neither unpleasant nor strong, but grounding. Historical observers often wrote with surprise about how temperate the air inside such hollows remained, even when outside temperatures plunged far below freezing. In some regions, travelers noted that sleeping in a living tree felt warmer than a tent and drier than a cave. The trunk itself acted as insulation, windbreak, and breathing wall all at once. You reach out and press your palm flat against the interior. It's warm, not because the bark generates heat, but because it holds the warmth you and the fire have created, then slowly releases it back. It's a steady, patient warmth, nothing like the instant blast of modern heaters. This was a kind of thermal conversation between human and tree, each giving and receiving through the long night. A curious practice found in some winter traditions involved listening closely to the tree at night. People would lie quietly against the bark and pay attention to the creaks and subtle pops that echoed through its frame. Some said these sounds foretold changes in the weather. A sharp crack high in the trunk might mean a sudden temperature drop. A long, low groan could signal snow piling heavily on the upper branches. Children were sometimes told that if they listened carefully enough, they could hear the spirit of the tree speaking in the night. Whether practical or playful, the result was the same. People grew attuned to their shelter's living rhythms in ways most of us have long forgotten. Scholars have spent decades puzzling over how exactly these hollow shelters managed airflow so effectively. Some argue it was purely the luck of natural chimney shapes, trees that happened to hollow in ways that allowed just the right balance between smoke release and heat retention. Others believe there was deliberate human intervention. Some trees, after all, show evidence of slight modifications near the upper vents, as if someone widened or narrowed the openings with heated sticks. This debate is more than academic. It touches on how deeply people understood and interacted with their environment. Was it adaptation to chance, or skilled manipulation of natural forms? Perhaps it was both, unfolding over centuries of trial, observation, and shared knowledge. You tilt your head back and follow the smoke with your eyes. It drifts upward in a smooth, elegant column before disappearing through the chimney slit. Outside, the wind stirs again, but the smoke doesn't blow back inside. The draft created by the warm air rising keeps the flow steady. This is the quiet genius of the tree's design. Its massive trunk holds heat, Its vent lets smoke escape, and its sealed base keeps out drafts. You're sitting inside a natural living structure that doesn't just protect you from the cold, it collaborates with you to manage it. The air feels different here than in the open. It's warmer, yes, but it also has weight, like the tree's moisture, and your breath have mingled into something new. When everyone inside exhales, the hollow absorbs it. Over the night, a subtle fog may form near the top of the interior, where warm air meets the cold edges of bark. In the morning, droplets sometimes collect and drip softly, like the tree itself is sweating under its winter coat. Travelers expected this, and even welcomed it. It meant the temperature inside had stayed high enough to keep the cold at bay. You close your eyes and lean your head against the bark. The sound of the forest outside fades until all that remains is the tree's subtle voice. Creaks, breaths, the faint crackle of embers. It's easy to imagine a child centuries ago doing exactly this, pressing an ear against the wall, convinced they could hear the heartbeat of the tree. In a way, they weren't wrong. What you're experiencing isn't a dead structure like a cabin wall. It's a living organism sharing its warmth, bending with the wind, whispering through its fibers. Outside, the wind rattles the entrance flap, but the interior remains still, protected. The chimney draws the smoke, the bark holds the heat, and the people inside breathe in rhythm with the tree. This is no static shelter. It's dynamic, alive, constantly adjusting. And in that quiet cooperation between human and forest, the brutal winter night softens, just a little. The wind outside begins to wail through the treetops like some ancient chorus, but inside the hollow, the sound arrives softened, filtered through wood and moss. The fire's glow has settled into a quiet pulse, and the air feels almost heavy with warmth and smoke. It's the hour when conversation drops to whispers, when the darkness outside presses in and people turn inward, not just physically, but emotionally. Here, in this small cocoon carved from a living giant, stories take over. They pass from one mouth to another, weaving through the air like threads, stitching generations together. You picture the scene centuries ago, the hollow tree lined with birch bark, floor layered with spruce boughs, a family huddled close around the ember bed. The night stretches long, and survival depends not just on heat, but on community, on shared memory. Across many regions of North America, winter nights were storytelling nights. Historical accounts describe travelers stumbling upon groups inside hollow trees and hearing songs drifting out through the chimney slit, rising into the snowy darkness. One French trader wrote that he followed what he thought was the sound of distant chanting and found, to his astonishment, voices flowing from the belly of a tree as if it were alive and singing. Imagine hearing that in the middle of a moonless forest, a tree softly singing in the night. The stories told here weren't just idle entertainment. They carried instructions, warnings, humor, ancestral memory. Lullabies wrapped advice inside melody. Myths explained why rivers froze, why owls hooted at certain hours, why a particular grove should never be entered without respect. Some stories lasted only a few minutes, told in hushed tones as children dozed off. Others unraveled like long winter scarves, winding through hours of the night, told in gentle rhythm while embers glowed and frost gathered outside. In a world where nights were endless and distractions scarce, language became the warmth of the mind. There's a charming image that surfaces in a few oral traditions. Children pressing their ears to the inner bark while stories were told, as if the tree itself were listening too. Some believed that if you told a story inside a hollow tree, the tree would remember it, carrying the words upward through its trunk into the sky. It's a beautiful thought, that stories whispered by firelight could climb like smoke, mingling with stars and branches. You can almost see a child falling asleep like that, cheek against warm bark, drifting off while believing. The tree is cradling their dreams. Scholars have long debated whether these nighttime storytelling sessions were spontaneous, family affairs, or part of structured cultural practices that varied by tribe and season. Some argue that winter storytelling followed specific cycles. Certain myths could only be told in winter, when the world was quiet and spirits more willing to listen. Others believe these moments were flexible, adapted to each family's needs as they traveled and sheltered. The truth is probably layered. Some nights structured, some improvised, all woven into the fabric of survival and identity. You shift in your seat, imagining the weight of those stories pressing against the walls, filling the hollow with invisible echoes. Words spoken in winter have a way of sticking. In the silence outside, The forest seems to lean closer, listening. The hollow itself acts as an amplifier. Its curved interior catches the sound of voices and sends them upward in a soft, resonant hum. If you've ever spoken inside a hollow log or a cave, you know that peculiar echo. Now imagine it with songs, lullabies, myths about stars and ancestors. The tree becomes both shelter and storyteller, its hollow chest resonating with human memory. The ember bed pops suddenly, sending a tiny spray of sparks into the air. The sound is sharp but brief, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. You imagine someone's voice pausing then, letting the night absorb their words before continuing. Maybe a grandmother leans forward, her voice lowering, the children wide-eyed as she tells a cautionary tale about a trickster spirit who gets lost because he mocked the trees. Laughter follows, soft but real. Even in a world of constant danger, humor slips in through the cracks, a reminder that joy isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Outside, a distant owl hoots. Someone inside might take that as a sign, weaving the bird's call into the story, blurring the line between the forest voice and their own. The night is both setting and participant. You lean closer to the bark and imagine the low murmur of voices seeping into the wood, traveling upward like roots in reverse. These moments inside hollow trees weren't just about surviving cold. They were about preserving identity. Stories carried moral lessons, practical knowledge, and spiritual connections. Without them, warmth alone wouldn't have been enough. You can build a fire to keep your body alive. It's the stories that keep the soul awake. And as the night deepens and your imagined family drifts between waking and dreaming, their words swirl upward through the chimney slit, mingling with the stars, forgotten by history perhaps, but not by the forest that heard them. A soft rustle outside snaps your attention away from the glowing embers. At first, it's faint, like snow sliding off a branch, but then comes another sound, a deliberate crunch of something moving through the snow. You hold your breath. The forest at night is never truly empty, and hollow trees, as ingenious as they are, don't exist in isolation. They belong to a living ecosystem, one that keeps its own unpredictable hours. If you were sleeping here centuries ago, you wouldn't be alone. Not really. All around, in the shadows beyond your little bark doorway, animal neighbors stir. Imagine lying here in the darkness, the fire's glow a faint halo, and hearing the distant hoot of an owl sweep through the treetops. It's not just background noise, it's a signal. Indigenous travelers could identify different owl calls and often interpreted them as signs of weather, of hunting prospects, sometimes even of spiritual messages. Just beyond the tree line, a raccoon noses through the snow, pawing at frozen roots, while a fox moves silently across a nearby clearing, leaving elegant tracks that look like stitched patterns on white cloth. The night is alive with small movements. Your hollow may keep the cold at bay, but out here, it's part of a larger network of winter survival. Historical accounts often mention the practical coexistence between humans and animals around these tree shelters. One 18th century traveler wrote, somewhat bemused, about finding a hollow sycamore with both human bedding and raccoon tracks crisscrossing the entrance. He couldn't tell who had claimed it first. In some places, these giant trees were shared spaces, unofficial motels for anyone, human or otherwise, smart enough to seek shelter. Sometimes families would arrive at a familiar hollow, only to find it already occupied by a family of porcupines or a black bear settling in for hibernation. Decisions had to be made quickly. Wait it out, move on, or try to negotiate the space. You imagine that conversation wasn't always peaceful. Here's a wonderfully strange little tidbit from oral stories in parts of the Northeast. Some people believed that raccoons, with their dexterous little hands, were keepers of the door. If a raccoon nested near the entrance of a hollow tree, it was seen as a sign of luck or protection. Travelers might even leave scraps of food for them, not out of charity, but respect. Better a raccoon at the door than a wolf sniffing at the flap. There's something unexpectedly charming about picturing a raccoon as your winter doorman, eyeing you from the shadows with a mix of suspicion and tolerance. You sit quietly now, listening. Somewhere to your left, a low hoot echoes again, and farther off, the distant yip of a coyote drifts through the trees. If you were here centuries ago, those sounds wouldn't simply be eerie, they'd be part of your nightly calculations. Is the owl's call a warning? Is the coyote alone or part of a pack trailing deer through the snow? Every sound carries information, and people who slept in hollows learned to read this nighttime language. the way you might glance at weather radar on your phone. Scholars have long discussed how animals influence the location and use of these shelters. Some argue that people deliberately chose hollows near areas where certain animals were active, not only because these areas were rich in resources, but because animal behavior often predicted weather changes. Others suggest the proximity was purely coincidental. Both humans and animals simply sought out the best shelters, often the same ones. The debate remains open, in part because the evidence left behind is ambiguous. Were the tracks outside a hollow made before or after human occupation? Did people adapt to animal habits, or did animals adapt to theirs? You lean slightly toward the entrance and peer into the night. The darkness outside feels thick, almost physical. Your breath puffs out in little clouds that catch the faint ember glow before vanishing. Then, just beyond the clearing, two small points of light flicker, eyes reflecting back. For a moment, your heart races, but then you catch the shape. A deer, its body outlined faintly against the snow. It steps cautiously, ears twitching, then moves on, hooves crunching softly. You realize how much life moves silently, just beyond the ring of light, going about its nocturnal rituals as it has for centuries. Inside the hollow, people would have acknowledged these night visitors in different ways. Some might whisper short prayers, thanking the forest for its company. Others might adjust their sleeping positions to block drafts if they suspected curious animals would sniff near the entrance. The shared presence wasn't entirely threatening. It was expected. You were a guest in their territory, not the other way around. The ember bed pops again, and you glance back toward the warmth. For a moment, you imagine a child pulling a fur blanket tighter, eyes wide as they listen to the night orchestra outside. Maybe an elder leans close and whispers, "Don't fear the eyes in the dark. They're listening to us too." It's a line that feels both practical and poetic. In this winter world, survival didn't mean shutting the forest out entirely. It meant coexisting within its breathing rhythms. As the sounds fade and your heartbeat steadies, you settle back into the hollow. The animals outside continue their quiet wanderings, invisible but present. In some ways, their movements mirror yours, finding warmth, finding shelter, finding ways to last through the long, frozen night. You and they are part of the same story, sharing the same forest, separated only by a thin shell of bark. The night has settled fully now, and the hollow is wrapped in a deep, velvety silence broken only by the occasional sigh of wind and the soft crackle of coals. You shift your position on the spruce boughs beneath you, feeling the springy texture cushion your weight. It's surprisingly comfortable, not luxurious, but enveloping in a way that makes the bitter cold outside feel like a distant rumor. Inside this wooden chamber, sleeping arrangements weren't haphazard. They followed a rhythm, a structure born of both practicality and tradition. When the temperature dipped low enough to make breath frost mid-air, where you lay, how you layered yourself, and who slept beside you could mean the difference between waking to a new dawn or never waking at all. Picture a family settling in for the night. The elders choose their spots first, usually at the back of the hollow where the warmth pooled thickest and drafts were weakest. Children nestle between adults, not only for protection, but because their smaller bodies lose heat more quickly. Hunters or travelers often slept closer to the entrance, alert to any movement outside. This wasn't just a sleeping arrangement, it was a choreography of warmth and vigilance. Early European observers often remarked, with a kind of startled respect, how organized these interiors were. Not unlike birds in a nest, one noted. Each knew his place, and the warmth increased as bodies drew close. That nesting instinct was no accident. It was centuries of adaptation made tangible. The bedding layers were thoughtful too. A base of spruce boughs was standard in many regions, but on top of that came layers of hides, woven mats, or thick furs depending on what resources were at hand. Some communities placed their thickest hides on top, letting the body's heat build between layers, much like a primitive but effective sleeping bag. You imagine the slow ritual, boughs laid, hides unrolled, edges tucked carefully to keep drafts from slipping in. It's easy to see modern camping gear as sophisticated, but these arrangements were masterpieces of warmth built entirely from the forest itself. Here's a small, endearing detail that surfaces in a few oral stories. Some families kept smooth river stones near the ember bed, letting them heat up through the evening. Just before sleeping, someone would roll a warm stone into the center of the bedding layers, wrapping it in bark or cloth. It radiated gentle heat through the night, like an ancient hot water bottle. Picture a child giggling as the warm stone is placed by their feet, wriggling against it before curling up between relatives. It's such a quiet, human moment, a tiny gesture against the immense cold. As everyone settled, the interior of the hollow would grow warmer by degrees. Human bodies, closely packed, acted as both insulation and heat source. The curved walls of the tree trapped that heat, preventing it from escaping into the frozen night. Over hours, breath condensed softly on the interior walls, leaving faint, glistening patches that would sometimes drip by morning. If you've ever slept in a small tent in winter, you know this sensation. The air heavy with shared breath, the walls slick with dew. But here it happens in a living tree, and somehow that feels different. Less like confinement, more like the hollow itself is joining in, holding the night close. Scholars have long debated the exact number of people who could realistically sleep inside some of these massive trees. Some accounts describe families of 4 or 5 comfortably nesting together. Others, particularly those referencing the largest sycamores of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, suggest groups of up to a dozen could crowd inside when necessary. Skeptics argue that these larger numbers were likely temporary emergency measures, pointing out that body heat and smoke management would become difficult with too many people in one hollow. Others believe the accounts are accurate, citing the extraordinary girth of some trees, up to 14 feet in diameter, and the sophisticated way entrances and venting were managed. Standing here in your imagination, it's easy to see how both might be true. Some hollows were intimate nests, others communal shelters during especially brutal nights. You lie back against the bark, eyes tracing the faint lines of soot above. It's easy to imagine the order settling into place. Someone near the entrance shifts their weapon within reach. A child curls into a parent's side. An elder pulls their fur tighter around their shoulders. Conversation fades into quiet murmurs, then to silence broken only by the occasional sigh of shifting bodies. The warmth builds slowly, not like the flip of a switch, but like embers catching through a stack of logs. You feel the air thicken, the chill receding inch by inch. Outside, the forest is vast and indifferent. Inside, the hollow has become a tiny universe of human warmth. Bodies arranged like pieces in a puzzle designed to withstand the night. Every inch of space is used wisely. No one sprawls. No one wastes heat. It's efficient, yes, but also intimate. There's a trust inherent in sleeping so close. Breath mingling, backs pressed against bark and each other. In this world, survival isn't solitary. It's communal. Somewhere near the entrance, a light draft sneaks in, rustling the edge of a hide. A hunter stirs, adjusts it, and the silence returns. The fire's glow casts low, flickering shadows that stretch across faces, softening sharp features into gentle silhouettes. If you listen closely, you might hear a child's soft snore, the muffled creak of bark, and the steady rhythm of human breathing, layered sounds forming a lullaby older than any language. You close your eyes and let yourself sink into that rhythm. The hollow is no longer just a shelter. It's a carefully orchestrated sleeping chamber, warm and alive, where each person plays a part in keeping the night at bay. In the cold heart of winter, nestled inside a living tree, this is how people once slept. Not as individuals scattered in the dark, but as a single breathing constellation of warmth. The night stretches on, the forest outside shifting under the weight of snow and wind, while inside the hollow the ember bed remains the quiet, glowing center of everything. You sit closer to it now, feeling the heat rise from the coals in gentle waves. There's no roaring flame, no dramatic blaze, just a bed of carefully tended embers glowing like the slow heartbeat of the shelter. This tiny core of fire is the difference between the living warmth of a winter night and the dangerous cold waiting just beyond the bark. The placement of that ember bed was never random. Generations learned through careful experience where to set it, so heat spread evenly but smoke didn't linger. Most placed it near the center of the hollow, not too close to the walls. Living trees can scar or split if overheated, and not directly beneath the chimney slit either, to avoid losing too much warmth upward. The balance is precise. Too far to one side and the warmth won't reach everyone. Too close to the entrance, and cold air creeps in with every shift of the wind. Travelers in the northeastern woodlands were known to scrape shallow depressions into the earthen floor, creating a natural basin to cradle the embers, keeping them stable through the night. It's fascinating to think that these fires weren't just sources of warmth. They were almost like members of the group. Someone always had an eye on them, even while drifting in and out of sleep. In some winter camps, people took turns tending the coals through the night, ensuring the temperature stayed steady. One 18th century observer wrote of finding a hollow tree at dawn, still faintly smoking from inside, with coals so neatly banked in ash that a mere breath revived the flame. It's such a simple but beautiful image. The morning beginning not with striking new fire, but with a soft exhale bringing life back to something that has quietly waited all night. Quirky little practice described in some oral histories involved covering the ember bed with a thin layer of damp bark near midnight. Almost like tucking it in, the moisture slowed the burn, keeping the coals alive longer without constant feeding. Come morning, the bark would be charred through, but the embers underneath still glowing, ready to flare with a bit of breath and fresh kindling. Imagine waking in the pre-dawn cold, peeling away that blackened layer like lifting the lid on a secret furnace, and feeling the warmth still there, steady, dependable. As with many aspects of these shelters, scholars have debated how regularly fire was maintained inside hollow trees. Some argue that keeping embers burning all night was standard practice, pointing to accounts of early explorers who saw faint plumes of smoke rising from tree trunks at dawn. Others believe fires were often allowed to die down, relying more heavily on body heat and insulation during the deepest parts of the night, both to conserve fuel and to reduce the risk of accidental flare-ups in confined spaces. There's evidence for both approaches, likely varying by tribe, tree size, and weather conditions. Some hollows were big enough to accommodate a well-managed ember bed safely. Others, more cramped, may have required periods of darkness to keep the tree from scorching. You lean forward and stir the embers gently with a stick. They respond instantly, glowing brighter, a soft hiss rising as tiny sparks swirl upward. The heat intensifies for a moment, spilling into the hollow like a sigh. There's a rhythm to this act that feels timeless. You're not commanding the fire, you're conversing with it, coaxing rather than forcing. Every movement, adding a twig, shifting a coal, banking the ash, is done with quiet intent. It's easy to imagine someone centuries ago doing the same. Wrapped in furs, their face lit by the red glow, eyes half closed with exhaustion, but hands steady. Maybe a parent stirring the fire while children sleep pressed against their side. Or a lone traveler feeding it carefully in the dead of night, whispering to themselves to stay awake just a little longer. Fire wasn't just physical warmth, it was company. The hollow amplifies the crackle of the embers in a way that's strangely comforting. Each pop echoes softly off the curved bark, filling the small space like a lullaby. Outside, the wind still moves through the forest in long, low gusts, but here the ember bed hums its quiet defiance. It doesn't rage against the winter. It endures steadily, like the trees themselves. You shift your gaze upward and notice how the smoke rises lazily, following the invisible path you've come to trust. A single glowing fleck floats upward, disappears through the chimney slit, and vanishes into the night sky. It's a fleeting thing, that ember spark, alive for only seconds. Yet in that moment, it connects the interior world of warmth with the vast, frozen dark above. If the family inside stirs at night, they do it quietly. Someone near the entrance might reach over, give the ember bed a little nudge, adjust a bark flap to keep the draft just right, then drift back towards sleep. There's a shared trust in that glowing heart. Everyone relies on it, but no one panics over it. They know its rhythm. It's a relationship built through centuries of practice. The fire does its part. The people do theirs, and together they make it through the night. You hold your hands out, feeling the heat radiate across your palms. It's not the blast of a furnace. It's subtle, steady, personal. In this tiny chamber carved into a tree, it's the center around which everything else turns. Warmth, security, sleep, breath. Without it, the hollow would be just a cold shell. With it, it becomes a living hearth in the heart of the forest. The embers glow low, a quiet pulse beneath the curved walls, as the night reaches its coldest, most secret hour. This is the moment when exhaustion sets in, when conversation has faded, when even the wind outside seems to slow. You shift deeper into the hollow, the bark at your back warm from hours of steady heat. Your eyelids grow heavy, and in that drifting state between waking and sleep, the forest begins to take on a different shape. Shadows lengthen, the smoke spirals strangely, and your mind starts to wander into the same territory where countless sleepers before you once found themselves, between firelight and dream. In winter, inside these tree hollows, Dreams weren't just private experiences. They were threads in a larger tapestry of meaning. Many indigenous communities believed that winter nights held a unique kind of spiritual potency, that the long hours of darkness opened doors between the human world and something older, quieter, watching. Historical accounts from early missionaries and traders often described how people would recount their dreams in the mornings, treating them not as idle fantasies but as messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes blessings, sometimes puzzles to unravel. One Jesuit missionary in the 17th century wrote with uneasy awe about men who slept within trees and spoke at dawn of visions they swore the wood itself had carried to them. You lean your head against the inner bark, listening. The tree creaks softly, a sound that now feels less like structure settling and more like something breathing beside you. Outside, the wind brushes past the entrance with a low hum, and the smoke rises in a smooth column toward the slit above. If you were lying here centuries ago, your body wrapped in furs, your stomach full of dried meat and warm broth, this is the hour when your thoughts would dissolve into the rhythm of the forest. The boundary between inside and outside, between you and the tree, would blur. Your dreams might carry the shapes of animals moving silently through the snow or ancestors whose voices drift just beyond the firelight, a charming detail. From some winter traditions says that children were sometimes told to whisper their hopes into the tree before sleeping, as if leaving them in the care of a guardian. A child might press their tiny hands against the bark and murmur wishes. Safe travel for a parent, good hunting tomorrow, a dream of seeing a lost grandparent. In the morning, if a vivid dream came, the elders would nod knowingly and say, "The tree heard you." It's easy to imagine a child curling up afterward, heart lighter, trusting the hollow to keep their whispers safe through the night. Scholars have long debated how literally such practices were taken. Some argue that these were deeply spiritual rituals, rooted in animistic beliefs about trees as conscious beings that could mediate between human and spirit worlds. Others believe they were symbolic, serving as gentle ways to teach children respect for their environment and provide psychological comfort during harsh winters. The line between faith and function is blurry, and perhaps it always was. When you live this closely with the forest, sleeping inside it, depending on it for survival, the idea of it listening doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels natural. You close your eyes for a moment, and the darkness behind your lids isn't empty. It swirls with the faint glow of embers and the slow, rhythmic movement of the smoke. In this in-between state, every sound in the hollow deepens. The soft breathing of imagined companions, the tiny pops of settling wood, the distant crack of ice outside. It's not hard to see how dreams here could feel different, more vivid, more tethered to the world around you. A flicker of fire might become the eyes of a spirit in a dream. The groan of a tree shifting under snow might be heard as a whispered message. Some winter dream stories have been passed down through generations. There are tales of hunters dreaming of animals who later appeared on the trail exactly as seen in sleep, or of travelers receiving warnings to move before a storm struck. These stories aren't told with wide-eyed superstition, but with a calm, matter-of-fact tone, as if to say, of course the tree shared something with us. Of course the night has its own language. You imagine the interior now filled with sleeping figures. One child mutters softly, chasing something in a dream. An elder's breathing is deep and steady. A hunter stirs once, pulls the fur tighter, and returns to sleep. The ember bed glows faintly, throwing gentle shadows up the walls. Smoke drifts upward in a straight, quiet line, carrying the breath of sleepers and fire into the dark sky. Outside, the forest doesn't sleep. A fox slips through snow. A branch cracks somewhere in the distance. The stars wheel slowly overhead. But inside the hollow, there's a suspended stillness, as if the world has paused to listen to the dreams murmuring within. The line between the living wood and the sleeping people has blurred completely. This is a moment few modern walls can replicate. A merging of body, shelter, and night so complete that even your dreams feel like they belong to the forest. The forest outside has reached that deep frozen hour where everything seems to hold its breath. The stars sit motionless overhead, and the snow has stopped falling, leaving the world blanketed and utterly still. Inside the hollow, the ember bed glows faintly, breathing its slow light into the curved walls. Everyone is asleep now, or almost everyone. In shelters like this, sleep was never total. Someone always stayed half awake, listening to the night, keeping an eye on the fire, and watching the entrance. This quiet vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was survival. You picture a figure near the opening, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, sitting with knees drawn up, their silhouette barely outlined against the faint glow behind them. Maybe it's a hunter, accustomed to listening for the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. Maybe it's a parent, watching over children curled in a warm nest toward the back. The night watchers weren't chosen randomly. They were often those with sharp hearing, quick reflexes, or simply the endurance to fight off sleep during the coldest hours. One historical observer from the early 1700s described stumbling upon a tree shelter in the northern woodlands and finding a single man awake at its mouth, like a sentinel at a gate, tending a small coal fire with quiet hands. The image is stark and intimate. One human, one ember bed, one immense forest. It wasn't just animals that warranted this midnight vigilance. Winter storms could shift quickly, sending sudden gusts that tore through the woods. A poorly secured entrance flap could let a freezing draft snake inside, undoing hours of careful warmth. Snow could pile unexpectedly high, blocking the vent or pushing against the walls. In some regions, falling ice or broken limbs were as dangerous as predators. A night watcher's job was to respond to those sudden changes before they became threats. It wasn't a role of heroics. It was quiet, essential guardianship. There's a wonderfully odd little detail that surfaces in some oral stories. Watchers sometimes carried a small pouch of crushed dried leaves or bark that, when tossed into the embers, released a sharp, fragrant smoke. This wasn't for cooking or ceremony. It was a kind of natural alert system. If drowsiness crept in, tossing a pinch of these leaves into the coals would produce a burst of scent and light smoke, enough to sting the nose and jolt the senses awake without disturbing the others. It's a simple, clever trick, and you can imagine someone fighting off heavy eyelids, reaching for that pouch, and inhaling sharply as the smoke rises like a forest-born alarm clock. Scholars have long discussed whether this practice of keeping night watchers was formalized or simply instinctual. Some argue that it followed structured shifts, particularly among larger groups, rotations decided in advance, ensuring no one grew too exhausted. Others believe it was more fluid, based on who happened to wake during the night, or who naturally struggled with deep sleep. The evidence is scattered. Journals describe both disciplined rotations and casual, voluntary watching. Likely, as with many traditions, it varied from place to place, shaped by group size, weather severity, and cultural norms. You lean toward the entrance, imagining what the watcher would see: the black expanse of forest, interrupted only by the pale shimmer of starlight on snow. Every sound becomes amplified in that kind of darkness. A branch cracking 100 feet away sounds like it's just outside. The faint rustle of an animal can make your heart jump before you remember that it's probably just a fox. And then there's the sound of your own breath, steady, controlled, the one thing you can rely on. A watcher's presence was both practical and psychological. Their quiet wakefulness reassured everyone else inside, even in sleep. Someone was awake. Someone was listening. You can imagine the conversations whispered between watchers in the trees. Not in any mystical sense, necessarily, but in that way people talk softly to the night when no one else is awake to hear. Maybe a quiet joke muttered under the breath to keep from nodding off. Maybe a hunter tracing plans in their mind for the next day's trail. Maybe someone whispering a prayer to the forest spirits, or simply thanking the hollow for holding the night together. These were hours where the line between thought and voice blurred. The embers shift, sending a faint glow across the bark. The watcher leans forward, stirring the coals gently, careful not to send sparks flying up the chimney slit. The orange light blooms for a heartbeat, illuminating the interior. You can see the sleeping faces briefly in that light. Children bundled tight, elders curled near the back, the walls glistening faintly with condensation. Then the glow settles again, and the watcher returns to their quiet post. Outside, the forest is vast, indifferent, and full of hidden movement. Inside, a single pair of eyes keeps the night at bay. It's a simple act, easy to overlook in stories of grand survival. But in truth, it might be the most human moment of all. One person awake while others sleep, tending to fire and darkness. It's an act as old as time itself. And here, in the hollow of a great tree, that tradition holds steady against the winter night. The first light of dawn creeps in slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the sun itself hesitates to disturb the winter silence. The forest outside glows faintly blue, every branch coated with a thin layer of frost that catches the early light like glass. Inside the hollow, the air has cooled slightly, but remains wrapped in a soft warmth that clings to the bark. The ember bed is a shallow nest of fading orange, breathing its last heat into the morning. You stir, stretching beneath layers of hides, feeling the stiffness of a night spent curled against bark and bough. There's a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes after a long, hard cold, but also a quiet triumph. You've made it through the night. In winter encampments centuries ago, this moment between darkness and day wasn't simply a yawn and stretch affair. It was a ritual in itself, marked by careful, practiced movements. One observer traveling through the Ohio Valley in the early 18th century described stumbling upon a hollow sycamore at dawn, surprised to find the smoke issuing gently from its top like breath from a sleeping beast, and inside, figures stirring with the discipline of soldiers. There's a rhythm to the way people rose in these shelters, quiet, deliberate, every action shaped by both necessity and respect for the forest around them. The watcher by the entrance is the first to move, shaking off the stillness of the night. They step out into the brittle cold, snow crunching beneath their feet, scanning the woods for tracks laid during the dark hours. Any sign, a paw print, a broken branch, a faint trail, could change the plans for the day. Others begin to sit up inside, rolling their shoulders, adjusting layers, pulling on moccasins that had been tucked near the embers to stay warm. The air is crisp and each breath puffs upward like smoke. Outside, the trees gleam with the frost's pale light, silent and massive. One small, almost playful morning habit, described in some oral histories, involves children rushing to the entrance as soon as they're awake, trying to catch the very first ray of sunlight that slips through the trees. Some believed it brought good luck for the day, a way to greet the forest before the tasks of survival began. You can imagine their little footprints in the snow outside the hollow, faces red from cold but eyes bright with excitement, their laughter rising briefly before fading back into the quiet winter air. The adults' tasks are more measured. Someone gently stirs the ember bed, coaxing the faint glow into flame with a bundle of dry bark and moss. Smoke curls upward through the chimney slit, slow and pale against the dawn. Another person might step outside to brush snow away from the entrance, clearing the area before it becomes too hard-packed by foot traffic. These aren't grand gestures. They're the kind of steady, practiced acts that keep life moving when the world is frozen solid. Scholars have long debated whether these morning routines were standardized across different regions or if they evolved uniquely within each community. Some evidence suggests common patterns: checking tracks at first light, reviving embers, sealing or dismantling entrance coverings. Others argue that local conditions, tree type, climate, family structure, shaped how each group handled the morning. In some traditions, shelters were quickly abandoned after a single night. In others, families lingered for days, using the hollow as a temporary winter base before moving along hunting routes. The forest didn't enforce one way of living. It offered options, and people adapted with nuance. You step outside in your mind and feel the immediate bite of the morning air. The world is eerily still. No birds yet, no rustle of leaves, just the occasional distant crack as ice shifts in the trees. Frost clings to everything. The entrance to the hollow looks almost mythical now, steam rising faintly from the warmth within, snow piled gently around its base. In some places, people intentionally left this steam to drift, marking their location for nearby hunting parties who knew where to find them. In others, they brushed snow over the entrance entirely to hide their presence, erasing signs of human habitation like ghosts fading with the night. Back inside, the space that held the night's dreams begins to transform back into something more functional. Bedding is shaken out and dried near the fire. Birch bark lining that absorbed condensation is adjusted or replaced. If the shelter is to be left behind that day, someone might scatter a layer of snow or earth over the fire pit, making sure no coal is left to smolder unattended. Sometimes coals are wrapped in bark bundles to carry along, keeping the flame alive for the next shelter. A continuity of warmth that threads through each day like a quiet heartbeat. You imagine the children now bundled tightly, perched near the entrance as the adults discuss the route ahead. Maybe they're heading toward a river to check fishing weirs under the ice, or following a trail they mapped mentally long before the snow fell. Maybe they're staying another night, waiting out a storm. The decisions are made quickly, but thoughtfully, guided by knowledge accumulated over generations. The forest doesn't allow for wasted time at dawn. The sun finally breaks fully over the horizon, spilling cold golden light across the clearing. It glints off the frost-coated trees, dazzling, almost blinding. The forest stirs faintly, an owl returning to its roost, the faint scrabble of a squirrel. And there you stand, at the mouth of a hollow tree, looking out at a winter world that feels both immense and strangely intimate. The night has passed. The hollow has done its job. What happens next depends on the day, the weather, and the path ahead. The sun has risen higher now, though it offers little warmth in the brittle winter air. You step outside the hollow and feel that sharp, crystalline cold that bites at the inside of your nose. The forest stretches in every direction, vast and brilliant, the snow crusted over from the night's freeze. The tree behind you stands quietly, its hollow entrance still exhaling faint threads of steam. If last night was about hunkering down, this moment is about carrying the night's warmth forward. Because in these winters, warmth wasn't just something you enjoyed, it was something you packed, preserved, and moved with you like a precious heirloom. Imagine a small group preparing to leave their tree shelter at dawn. One person kneels beside the ember bed, carefully peeling away the ash to expose the glowing heart within. They pick out a few coals, small but fiercely alive, and tuck them into a bundle of bark or moss, wrapping it tight to insulate against the cold. These ember bundles were carried like delicate treasures, often nestled inside larger packs or tucked under clothing to keep them from dying out. Historical records from explorers moving through the Great Lakes region in the 17th and 18th centuries describe watching indigenous travelers revive campfires in minutes using these ember bundles, as if carrying fire itself through the forest. "They bring yesterday's flame as though it were a sleeping child," one French trader wrote, clearly astonished. You watch as the imagined group moves methodically. Someone adjusts their snowshoes, tightening the sinew bindings. Another brushes snow away from the base of the tree, leaving only faint tracks behind. A few children, if they're present, help pack spruce boughs into bundles, either to carry along or to leave behind neatly, almost as if paying respect to the shelter. Before stepping away, someone might place a small piece of bark or moss near the entrance, a quiet marker indicating the hollow's condition for others who might pass through later. These weren't abandoned shelters. They were part of a living network in the landscape, known and remembered. Here's a small, curious detail passed down through a few winter traditions. Travelers would sometimes tuck a single pine cone or pebble inside the now cold hollow before leaving, almost like a signature. Some say it was a playful way to let others know who had stayed there. Others claim it was a way to keep the tree's memory awake, acknowledging the shelter with a simple token. Picture it. A smooth pebble resting in the curve of the hollow floor, waiting silently for the next pair of hands to find it months later. A tiny, wordless message across time. The act of carrying embers is more than practical. It's poetic. A living coal, tucked into bark, is like a promise that the next night's fire is already halfway alive. Fire-starting methods were efficient, yes, bow drills, flint and steel. But on a freezing morning, saving time and effort mattered. That coal meant breakfast could begin sooner, fingers could thaw faster, spirits could lift more quickly. It's a gesture that speaks of deep familiarity with the elements. Not fighting the cold with brute force, but outsmarting it quietly. Scholars have long discussed whether this practice of ember carrying was universal across regions, or more common in areas with harsher winters. Some argue it was widespread, pointing to the near-identical descriptions found in European journals from the northeast to the plains. Others suggest that in places where dry tinder was plentiful, carrying embers may have been more situational than routine. Archaeological evidence is thin. Embers don't leave clear traces, but the consistency of descriptions across centuries hints at a shared knowledge that transcended geography. The group begins to move, their breaths puffing in synchronized rhythm, their footsteps crunching through the snow. The ember bundle is carried carefully, often by someone who walks steadily and avoids stumbling. If it dies, they'll still have fire by other means, but why risk it? The bark-wrapped coal glows faintly inside its little cocoon, unseen but vital, like a secret flame beating quietly against the cold. You turn to look back at the tree one last time. Its hollow is dark now, silent, but the faint marks of the night remain. The soot stains near the vent, the flattened boughs inside, the shape of snow disturbed by footsteps. It's not just a tree anymore. It's part of the journey, a stop in a long chain of winter survival. You imagine other travelers passing through in days or weeks, spotting the subtle markers, stepping inside, and feeling the residual warmth trapped in the bark. The shelter lives on, shared by people who may never meet, bound together by the same needs and knowledge. As the forest swallows the figures ahead, their ember bundle carried like a tiny sun tucked into the folds of their gear, you realize this morning routine isn't just about leaving. It's about connection, between nights, between families, between generations who walked this same snowy path and trusted the forest to help them endure. The hollow fades into the distance behind you, its role for now complete, as the living warmth moves forward. Snow crunches beneath your feet as you follow faint trails winding deeper into the forest. The air is brittle, sharp against your lungs, but there's something hypnotic about the rhythm of walking through this winter world. Each step leaves a crisp imprint, soon softened by drifting flakes. All around you, the trees stand tall and silent, their branches webbed with frost, their trunks etched with age. Somewhere between the sound of your breathing and the distant creak of ice-laden limbs, a quieter layer of the landscape begins to speak. Stories not told aloud, but embedded in the land itself. Out here, legends traveled with the snow. For centuries, hollow trees weren't just practical shelters. They were woven into the folklore that shaped how people moved through winter forests. Hunters, travelers, and families carried tales about specific trees and the roots that connected them, stories that blurred the line between map and myth. Historical journals from early explorers describe how guides often referred to trees by names rather than directions. Past the Bear's Cave, near Old Split Heart, then north toward Whispering Cedar. Some of those names were descriptive, others symbolic, but to those who knew the forest well, they were as clear as modern road signs. You pause beside a massive, lightning-scarred oak whose interior is blackened but intact. The opening faces south, its edges worn smooth. It's easy to imagine it once being called something like Thunder's Belly or the One-Eyed Sentinel. A few steps away, a set of faint tracks veer off toward the frozen river, just visible through the trees. You follow them, picturing travelers doing the same centuries ago, not by compass, but by stories, each tree along the way carrying whispers of those who'd passed before. There's a curious little detail found in a few oral traditions. Some travelers would deliberately leave shaped twigs or small carvings inside hollows to signal stories to those who followed. A bent twig might mean good hunting nearby. A carved notch could signal a dangerous path ahead. Sometimes these markers were playful, a kind of secret language between groups familiar with the same route. Imagine arriving at a hollow tree after a grueling day, ducking inside for shelter, and finding a small stick figure tucked into a crevice. It's both message and comfort. Someone has been here. Someone survived this road before you. The trails that connected these tree shelters were more than just practical routes. They were memory lines, passed down orally, repeated in songs and winter stories. Scholars have long debated how precise these narrative maps actually were. Some argue they functioned almost like a cartographic system, where legends about trees and landmarks gave travelers reliable directions through difficult terrain. Others suggest that while some locations were consistently marked in stories, much depended on seasonal familiarity and personal knowledge. Perhaps both are true. In a landscape that transformed dramatically with each snowfall, stories were the most flexible, enduring maps one could carry. You come to a narrow stream frozen over, its surface clear as glass. Beneath the ice, water still moves slowly like a creature breathing in its sleep. This spot might have been a waypoint, a place where travelers paused to refill bark containers with fresh water before pressing on to the next shelter. The hollow trees themselves formed a kind of constellation through the winter woods, fixed points in a shifting landscape. To outsiders, the forest may have seemed endless and disorienting. To those who belonged here, it was a network of living landmarks, each tied to stories that outlasted generations. As you walk further, the forest deepens, and the light softens into the muted glow of winter midday. A large sycamore looms ahead, its pale bark gleaming against the dark pines. The hollow at its base is wide enough for two people to walk inside standing upright. This tree, you imagine, might have had a legendary tale attached to it, a place where a hero once survived a terrible storm, or where a family found unexpected shelter during a migration. The forest isn't just a setting, it's a storyteller in its own right, using trees as chapters. The wind picks up suddenly, scattering snow from the branches in a glittering cascade. You pull your cloak, or in this imagined walk, your coat, tighter around you. It strikes you how these trails, invisible to modern maps, once held the full weight of winter survival. The stories of trees weren't idle myths. They were instructions encoded in memory. Forgetting them could mean losing your way. Remembering them meant moving through a frozen world with confidence, following the whispered directions of ancestors. You glance back toward the path you've walked. Your tracks already blur with new snow, almost gone, but the trees remain, as they have for centuries, holding their silent names and their remembered roles. Some stories are spoken, some are carved, and some live simply in the shape of a trunk facing south, waiting for another traveler to read it. The forest begins to change as you follow the trails deeper north, the trees growing taller, older, and more varied. You notice the shift in the way the wind moves between them, less chaotic, more muffled, as though the canopy itself is thicker here. This is where winter shelter practices began to take on distinct flavors depending on the landscape and the people who moved through it. Not every tree hollow told the same story. Across the vast stretches of the continent, different nations developed their own ways of working with the forest, adapting to the trees that grew in their homelands, like tailors fitting a winter coat to the body. In the northeast woodlands, sycamores and chestnuts were often the giants of choice. Their wide trunks and tendency to hollow naturally made them ideal winter refuges. Historical accounts from early colonists frequently mention stumbling upon enormous sycamores that could hold entire families, sometimes with space left over for storage. One 18th century traveler through the Ohio River Valley wrote of finding a hollow sycamore large enough to stable a horse and hang the hunter's gear along its walls. That image of a living tree, serving as both shelter and storeroom, captures the scale of these natural sanctuaries. Move westward, and the story shifts. Among certain plains and riverine groups, cottonwoods took center stage. Though not as wide as sycamores, they hollowed more quickly and grew along rivers where winter camps were often placed. Their soft wood allowed for easy shaping with fire and stone tools, making it possible to tailor hollows into snug, efficient spaces. And far to the northwest, among towering cedar and redwood forests, the hollows became monumental. Some cedar trunks were so vast that they weren't just sleeping spaces. They could be used as temporary gathering spots for multiple families during storms, a kind of living meeting hall under dripping boughs. A wonderfully quirky detail emerges from oral histories in certain cedar-rich coastal areas. Children were sometimes tasked with polishing the interior bark of hollow shelters with smooth stones or shells, not for decoration, but to make the surfaces less likely to snag clothing and hides during the night. Over time, these polished interiors took on a soft sheen, catching firelight like a carved wooden bowl. Imagine entering one of those cedar hollows at night, the polished walls glowing golden from the ember bed, the scent of resin hanging sweet and sharp in the air. It would feel less like hiding from the cold and more like stepping into the ribs of something ancient and alive. Scholars have long discussed how much of these regional differences were born purely from the availability of certain tree species, and how much reflected deeper cultural preferences. Some argue that the variations are simply practical. Different forests offer different trees, and people adapted logically to what was at hand. Others suggest that cultural meanings associated with certain species influenced shelter choices just as much as practicality. For example, cedar has spiritual significance in many coastal nations, often used in ceremonies and rituals. Choosing it for winter shelter might have carried layered meanings beyond its physical advantages. Sycamores, too, held roles in certain eastern stories as boundary keepers or elders of the forest. Were these trees chosen just because they were big, or because they were revered? The answer is likely both, intertwined seamlessly. You continue along the trail, noting how the forest itself seems to guide these differences. In sycamore country, the trees cluster near rivers, their pale trunks catching the winter sun like bones. In cedar country, the air grows damp and cool, the trunks rising like columns in some silent cathedral, their roots gripping the earth in twisting, ancient forms. Each forest offered a different kind of embrace, and each people found their own way to settle inside it. It's humbling to imagine how well these landscapes were read and understood. There was no one way to survive a winter night in a hollow tree. There were dozens, shaped by tree species, climate, migration routes, and cultural identity. This wasn't a monolithic tradition. It was a living, breathing set of practices as varied as the forests themselves. The knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed through generations by demonstration, story, and shared nights huddled against bark and snow. You pause beside a cedar, pressing your hand to its massive trunk. Its bark feels softer, almost spongy, and beneath it lies a hollow wide enough for several people to stand inside. The scent is incredible, resinous, earthy, grounding. In your mind, you imagine a coastal family gathered here centuries ago, a storm raging outside, the hollow glowing with firelight, the polished interior gleaming like a lantern in the rain. It's a different forest, a different way of life, but the core is the same. Human bodies and living wood, joined together to outlast winter. The forest is not uniform, and neither were the people who moved through it. Each adapted in their own way, creating a mosaic of survival strategies that mirrored the diversity of the land itself. You take a breath, the cedar's scent filling your lungs, and keep walking. Every new grove tells a slightly different version of the same enduring story. As you press deeper into the forest, the quiet rhythm of snow and wind is interrupted by a faint, unfamiliar sound, the crunch of boots not shaped by moccasins. You pause. For centuries, the practice of sleeping inside hollow trees was known almost exclusively within indigenous communities, but eventually foreign eyes stumbled upon it. Early European explorers, missionaries, and fur traders moving through these woodlands in the 17th and 18th centuries encountered the sight with a mixture of fascination, confusion, and sometimes disbelief. To them, the idea of living inside a tree seemed closer to fairy tale than survival strategy. One English explorer, traveling through the eastern woodlands in the mid-1600s, wrote of coming upon a monstrous tree, its belly hollowed and smoking like a chimney, only to find a family inside, warm and calm despite the storm raging outside. He described it as a most cunning habitation, devised by nature and perfected by their hands. Others were less charitable, recording the shelters in tones laced with curiosity, but also misunderstanding. Some likening them to savages burrowed like foxes, failing to see the sophistication behind the adaptation. It's striking to read these old journals and realize how alien the practice seemed to people who arrived with rigid expectations of architecture. You imagine the scene from both sides. A group of European traders trudges through waist-deep snow, their wool clothing damp and heavy, their iron tools clinking with each labored step. Ahead, through the trees, they see smoke rising, not from a lodge or cabin, but from the trunk of a massive sycamore. Cautious, perhaps a little unnerved, they approach, only to find warmth radiating from within, voices murmuring softly, and the faint glow of firelight spilling from a bark-framed doorway. To them, it must have looked otherworldly, a tree transformed into a home, blending so seamlessly with the landscape, it was almost invisible until you were right beside it. And here's a strangely delightful tidbit. Some explorers who stayed with indigenous guides during winter ended up sleeping inside these hollows themselves. A few even wrote about it later with a kind of sheepish admiration. One French missionary confessed that, after weeks of miserable cold in his tent, he was persuaded to sleep in the belly of a tree and found it warm beyond expectation. Though I could scarce imagine it at first, you can almost hear the grudging respect in his tone, the kind that comes only after personal experience melts skepticism. This meeting of perspectives between those who had known these forests for generations and those arriving with foreign eyes has long intrigued historians. Some argue that European observers adopted and adapted the practice, incorporating it into their own frontier survival strategies during especially harsh winters. Others believe their encounters were more fleeting, that they relied primarily on indigenous guides for shelter rather than learning the craft themselves. There's some evidence of both. In frontier journals, you find occasional references to traders hollowing out trees or sleeping in abandoned shelters, but never with the same finesse as those who'd grown up reading the forest like a book. You step back from the imagined tree and picture these encounters not as dramatic clashes, but as quiet moments of bewilderment and learning. In the deep winter woods, ideology mattered less than warmth. If you were freezing and someone showed you a hollow tree glowing with firelight inside, you didn't argue theory, you stepped in. For some Europeans, these shelters became temporary sanctuaries. For others, they remained curiosities to be described and then forgotten when stone and timber houses were built in settled towns. It's easy to underestimate how alien these forests were to those arriving from Europe. In a landscape where trees stood like ancient guardians, their trunks wide enough to walk through, the line between wilderness and shelter blurred in ways unfamiliar to men raised on clearings and cottages. To indigenous communities, these hollows were part of the living architecture of their homeland. To foreigners, they were marvels, or occasionally, unsettling mysteries. You glance upward at the tree branches, coated in ice, and imagine a small group of traders warming their hands over an ember bed inside a hollow for the first time. The air is smoky but pleasant, the walls surprisingly warm, their skepticism slowly dissolving into gratitude. Outside, the snowstorm howls. Inside, the night feels almost gentle. It's a rare kind of encounter. Not a battle, not a treaty, but a moment of shared human need in the dead of winter. The forest around you seems to hold the echoes of these interactions. The paths, the hollows, the rising plumes of smoke. They were witnesses to first meetings between worlds, not in grand halls, but beneath bark and stars. And while the journals might have reduced it to a paragraph or two, the reality was simple and profound. People who thought they understood everything about shelter discovered something entirely new inside a tree. As the years move forward in your mind's eye, the winter forest slowly begins to change. Paths that once saw only moccasin prints start to carry wagon ruts. Iron tools, wool blankets, and firearms travel farther inland. Trade routes knit distant regions together, bringing goods that shimmer with novelty and altering how people interact with the land. Among these shifts, the quiet tradition of sleeping inside hollow trees doesn't disappear overnight. It bends, adapts, and, in some places, fades. You walk along a frozen riverbank, watching how the landscape seems both familiar and subtly altered. Where once a small hunting party might have followed narrow trails between towering sycamores, now there's evidence of clearing. Stumps, split logs stacked for cabins, smoke drifting from permanent chimneys. European trade goods, iron hatchets, saws, nails, introduced new possibilities for shelter. Instead of spending days carefully hollowing a tree with fire and stone, a person could fell smaller trees and build a crude hut in far less time. The pressure of change wasn't just technological, it was cultural, woven through with shifting alliances, trade networks, and the spread of settlement. Historical records from the late 18th century onward mention hollow tree shelters less frequently, though not because the forests suddenly grew inhospitable. In many regions, indigenous groups began incorporating new materials into their seasonal camps, blending old methods with new tools. Some families lined hollows with traded wool blankets instead of only bark. Others carried lightweight metal kettles instead of bark containers, making ember management easier but shifting how fires were tended inside. This wasn't a rejection of tradition, it was evolution, subtle, layered, practical. One delightfully odd detail from frontier accounts describes traders and native families occasionally using hollow trees as storage spaces rather than sleeping. Shelters, once cabins or lodges, became more common. Some hollows were turned into makeshift pantries, their cool, stable interiors perfect for keeping smoked meat safe from animals. A few were even used as drop spots along trade paths, where wrapped bundles could be tucked inside for others to collect later. Imagine passing through a snow-covered grove, opening the dark mouth of a tree and finding a neatly wrapped package inside, like a woodland post office. Scholars often debate whether the decline in hollow tree sheltering was primarily driven by environmental change, like deforestation and loss of massive, old-growth trees, or by cultural shifts spurred by colonization and trade. Some argue that as forests were cleared for agriculture and settlement, the great trees that made the practice possible simply vanished. Others believe that even in regions where old trees remained, the influx of tools, goods, and new building methods slowly made tree sleeping less essential, especially for groups drawn into fur trade economies and fixed settlement patterns. Likely, both forces intertwined. Fewer massive trees, changing mobility, evolving needs. You stop beside an ancient stump, its rings exposed like a cross-section of time. It's easy to imagine what once stood here, a towering sycamore with a hollow wide enough to hold an entire family through the worst of winter. But the tree is gone, cut clean, its story interrupted. The forest feels thinner here, its voice quieter. The absence of those giants isn't just ecological, it's cultural. When the trees that shaped daily survival vanish, something invisible goes with them. Knowledge shifts, stories settle into silence, and practices once shared under the stars are folded away like winter clothes at the end of a season. Yet the tradition didn't disappear completely. Some families continued to use hollows on long hunting trips well into the 19th century. Oral histories tell of elders teaching younger generations how to spot a good hollow, even as permanent dwellings rose nearby. In certain remote areas, the knowledge persisted like embers beneath ash, ready to flare when needed. The forest, after all, still had its secrets for those willing to listen. You imagine this moment in time as a kind of in-between. A hunter might carry an iron axe in his belt, but still stop to check the resonance of a hollow trunk with a practiced knock. A family might sleep in a log cabin one night and a cedar hollow the next while traveling between wintering grounds. Traditions don't vanish all at once. They fade and fuse, leaving traces scattered like footprints in melting snow. The river ahead curves and disappears into frost-covered pines. Behind you, the remnants of a stump catch the morning light, its exposed rings glinting faintly. The forest has changed, yes, but echoes of the old ways linger. The hollow trees may no longer dominate winter survival as they once did, but their presence is felt in the quiet spaces between memory and adaptation. You take one last look at the stump, imagining the stories it once held, and keep walking toward the shifting horizon. The wind has shifted again, carrying with it a distant, almost imperceptible hum, like the forest remembering itself. You follow a narrow trail winding uphill, where old-growth trees still stand, their massive trunks resisting the centuries like ancient sentinels. Here, in these remnants of untouched woodland, it's easier to imagine a time when hollow tree shelters weren't curiosities or fading memories, but everyday realities woven into winter's rhythm. The landscape holds that feeling, the weight of old knowledge lingering in the bark. Standing before one of these giants, you run your hand along its base. The trunk is wide enough that 3 people could link arms and still not encircle it. There's a hollow on the north-facing side, its edges worn smooth by time, animals, and, perhaps, human hands long ago. Even now the space inside is dry, shielded from wind and faintly resonant when you speak. This tree has probably outlived generations, its hollow a quiet witness to changing ways of life. By the mid-19th century, as settlement expanded and industry transformed the landscape, these trees began to disappear more rapidly. Logging operations prized sycamores, chestnuts, cedars, and cottonwoods for their size and straightness. In some regions, entire groves that had sheltered families through countless winters were felled within decades to build ships, houses, and rail ties. Historical records from logging companies describe sycamores so wide that 2 men could sleep inside them while another cut. Written almost as novelty, not reverence. You can almost feel the casualness in those words, the way survival spaces became lumber, their stories stripped along with their bark. And yet, even as forests were cut down, the idea of sleeping inside a hollow tree didn't vanish completely. Travelers, hunters, and trappers continued to use them when needed, sometimes with surprising ingenuity. A particularly strange little anecdote survives from a diary kept by a trapper in the 1850s, who wrote of accidentally sharing a hollow sycamore with a black bear one frigid night. He on one side, the bear on the other, separated by a ridge of wood inside. "We both decided to keep quiet and wait for morning," he wrote dryly. You can picture that scene in the darkness. 2 winter survivors, utterly aware of each other, mutually agreeing not to ruin the arrangement. As centuries passed, scholars began to look back at these practices with fresh eyes, trying to piece together how widespread and culturally significant hollow tree sheltering truly was. Some argue that it was a stopgap, an ingenious but temporary solution used only when other shelter options were unavailable. Others counter that it was far more integral, embedded deeply in seasonal migration patterns and daily survival strategies, especially in areas where forests were dense and winters fierce. Archaeological evidence is scarce. Trees decay, burn, or are cut down, leaving little physical trace. The debate often hinges on oral histories, traveler journals, and fragmentary mentions in missionary records, like whispers caught in old pages. You step into the hollow before you, ducking slightly as you cross the threshold. Inside, the bark curves around you like the inside of a massive drum. The air is cool and still, and the acoustics are oddly gentle. Your breath bounces softly off the wood, like speaking inside a cathedral. Even without fire, it feels sheltered, the thick walls muting the wind outside. In that quiet, it's easy to sense why people would have trusted spaces like this. The forest itself offered rooms if you knew how to find them. Looking around, you imagine this hollow not as a ruin, but as it once was, lined with bark, moss tucked into gaps, an ember bed glowing at the center. The entrance sealed with bark slabs against the wind, a family curled together in warmth, their tools hung neatly from pegs hammered into the wood, a child whispering into the bark, hoping for a good dream. The scene feels close enough to touch. Outside, the trees creak as a gust of wind passes through, their tops swaying against the pale sky. You step out and turn back toward the hollow, realizing how rare such trees have become. In many places, only stumps and distant descriptions remain. But here, in this quiet grove, the tradition lingers. Not as a living practice, perhaps, but as a presence embedded in the land. It's a reminder that history doesn't just live in books or ruins. Sometimes it lives in standing wood, waiting patiently for someone to listen. The scholarly debates, the diaries, the industrial records, they all circle around this simple truth. For centuries, people survived winters not by conquering the forest, but by living inside it, quite literally. Hollow trees weren't symbols or shelters alone. They were companions through the cold, collaborators in survival. And standing here now, hand pressed against the rough bark of a survivor, you feel the forest remembering. Snow begins to fall again, softly this time. The flakes drifting down like slow-moving ash. You tilt your head back and watch them collect on the dark fabric of your coat, or maybe, centuries ago, on a fur-lined mantle, melting almost instantly against the lingering warmth of your body. The forest hushes under this kind of snowfall, as if listening to itself breathe. It's in this quiet that the stories surrounding hollow trees take on their richest hues, not just as practical shelters, but as sources of meaning, caution, and even reverence. Every culture that lived close to these forests had its own way of seeing these giants, and those perceptions left deep, subtle marks on how they were used. Among several Eastern nations, old sycamores and chestnuts weren't only places to sleep. They were sometimes seen as keepers of the past. Trees that had survived generations were thought to hold memories in their rings and whispers in their hollows. One 18th century missionary wrote, somewhat perplexed, about being told that the oldest trees do not sleep, and they watch men as men watch the stars. He dismissed it as poetic fancy. But if you've ever stood alone in a grove of massive trees on a snowy night, you know exactly why someone might feel that way. Inside these beliefs were smaller, more playful customs that reveal how deeply these trees were woven into daily life. In some communities, it was said that if you fell asleep inside a particularly ancient hollow without asking permission, spoken softly into the bark, you might wake up disoriented, convinced the tree had spun you around during the night. To avoid this, travelers would sometimes place a hand on the interior wall before lying down and murmur a few words, as if greeting a host. You can almost picture a weary hunter, snow still clinging to his boots, pausing at the threshold of a hollow tree to whisper a quiet hello before settling in. It's both tender and practical, a way of recognizing that you're entering a living space, not a dead structure. As more records were gathered, scholars began to puzzle over how much of this language surrounding trees was metaphor, spiritual belief, or literal practice. Some insist these customs were deeply spiritual, expressions of animism where trees were seen as relatives and protectors. Others interpret them as poetic traditions layered onto a fundamentally practical survival method. The debate is complicated by how these beliefs were recorded, usually by outsiders unfamiliar with the cultures they observed, often flattening nuanced ideas into simple phrases like tree spirits or superstitions. What's left to us now are fragments, and in those fragments, something remarkably human shines through. You imagine yourself standing before a giant sycamore on a stormy night, exhausted from travel, cold to the bone. The snow is piling up fast, and the forest feels both alive and vast in the darkness. You find the hollow, step inside, and feel the instant shift in the air, the muffled sound, the stillness, the protective curve of the trunk. Do you speak to the tree out of belief or instinct or gratitude? Maybe all three. In a landscape where survival depends on collaboration with the environment, these gestures don't need to fit neatly into categories. They simply exist. There's something profoundly moving about the way these stories blur the boundary between the human and the natural. The hollow trees weren't just shelters. They were companions, protectors, sometimes tricksters in folklore. Some stories tell of people who fell asleep inside a hollow during a blizzard and woke to find animal tracks circling the entrance, but never crossing it, interpreted as the tree having kept danger at bay. Others speak of dreams so vivid inside these spaces that people claim to have spoken with ancestors or animals through the bark. Whether literal or symbolic, these tales carry the weight of centuries spent listening to the winter night from inside living walls. The snowfall thickens now, coating the ground in a fresh layer that softens every sound. You place your hand against the rough bark of a massive trunk, fingers tracing grooves worn smooth by time. It's not hard to imagine a traveler hundreds of years ago doing the same thing, pausing at the edge of exhaustion, whispering a few words of respect before stepping into the tree's embrace. Maybe they left in the morning, believing they'd simply spent a night out of the wind. Or maybe they walked away, convinced they'd shared that night with something ancient and attentive. In these stories, half history, half myth, the forest reveals itself as more than a backdrop. It's a presence, one that shelters, listens, and sometimes responds in its own quiet way. And somewhere in the swirl of snow and silence, you can almost hear those old whispers still hanging in the air, waiting for someone to lean close and listen again. The snow has slowed to a faint flurry, drifting sideways through the forest like scattered ash from a distant fire. The air is utterly still. Even your footsteps sound hushed, as if the world itself is holding a breath. You wander deeper between the trees, and the hollow shelters that once defined winter survival start to feel less like distant history and more like quiet companions. Each trunk you pass seems to hold a memory, each hollow like a doorway to another time. And as the landscape unfolds, you begin to see how this tradition didn't just belong to the past, it echoed forward, subtly influencing how people interacted with the forest for centuries after. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when logging had consumed much of the old-growth sycamores and chestnuts in the east, people no longer relied on hollow trees for nightly survival the way their ancestors had, but their presence lingered in unexpected ways. Travelers, hunters, and even children exploring the woods sometimes stumbled upon enormous hollows left standing, like forgotten rooms in a house whose walls had fallen away. Historical photographs from the early 1900s show families posing inside trunks wide enough to drive a wagon through, grim reminders of both the tree's scale and their transformation from shelters to curiosities. In some places, people even staged small gatherings or picnics inside the shells of these giants, treating them with a mixture of novelty and nostalgia. There's a charming, almost mischievous story that survives from the Appalachian foothills. A traveling preacher in the 1880s supposedly held a winter sermon inside the hollow of a massive sycamore, lighting a small fire at the base and inviting people to crowd inside while snow fell outside. The acoustics of the tree, according to local law, made his voice sound as if heaven itself was speaking through the bark. Whether or not the tale is exaggerated, it paints a vivid picture of people still turning to these spaces, even as their original purpose faded, to gather warmth, share words, and listen to the winter night together. The question of legacy has fascinated historians and ethnographers for decades. Some argue that hollow tree sheltering was ultimately a practical adaptation to environmental conditions, and once new technologies emerged, iron tools, cabins, stoves, it faded without leaving much cultural residue. Others disagree, pointing to how these shelters shaped patterns of movement, storytelling traditions, and even architectural preferences. A few suggest that the familiarity with living inside curved, bark-covered walls may have subtly influenced the cozy, rounded interiors of early frontier cabins, or the way certain winter narratives persisted even after the trees were gone. It's not a debate with neat evidence. Trees decay, stories change, but the possibility lingers like smoke. You pause beside a fallen giant. Its hollowed trunk lies on its side, split open, the interior charred faintly from some long-ago ember bed. Moss has grown over the edges now, softening the once smooth walls. Standing inside it feels strangely like walking into a time capsule, the air cool and damp, the wood smelling faintly sweet beneath the rot. You imagine how many nights this tree may have held people through storms, its hollow alive with firelight and whispers, before wind or axe brought it down. Even in its fallen state, it feels like a place, not just a thing. All around, the forest carries scars and echoes of the old practice. In some communities, elders continue to tell winter stories that began with phrases like, "When we slept inside the trees," not as metaphors but as lived memories. Children who had never spent a night in a hollow still grew up knowing the cadence of those stories, the way the bark was supposed to feel beneath your hand, the way snow muffled the world outside. These were not tales of distant myth, but of grandparents' lives. You kneel down and place your hand against the interior wall of the fallen trunk. It's cold now, but solid, unmoving, like the residue of a conversation that ended long ago. The ember bed is gone, the moss has crept in, and the forest has reclaimed what it gave. And yet, in this simple act of stepping inside, you can feel how deeply intertwined humans once were with this living architecture. Not as conquerors, not as decorators, as cohabitants. The flurries outside are picking up again, swirling against the grey sky. You step back out of the hollow and glance around. Some traditions leave behind monuments of stone. Others leave invisible paths traced only in stories and habits. This one left both. Hollows that sheltered bodies and narratives that sheltered memory. Even as the trees fell and winters changed, the echo of people sleeping inside living trunks carried on, woven into landscapes, stories, and perhaps even the way people still instinctively lean toward the shelter of a tree when the wind begins to howl. The snow has stopped. The forest is wrapped in that peculiar stillness that follows a storm. No wind, no birds, just the faint creak of branches under their new weight. You find yourself standing in a clearing ringed by ancient trees, their trunks massive and scarred, their roots knotted like the backs of old hands. It feels fitting to end the journey here, in a place where past and present seem to overlap so quietly that it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends. When winter nights stretched long and resources were scarce, hollow trees were more than practical shelters. They were a bridge between people and landscape. Historical references to them stretch across regions. From the river valleys of the east to the cedar-rich coasts of the northwest, explorers noted them with surprise. Missionaries sometimes misunderstood them. Travelers adopted them when necessity demanded it. Some of the largest sycamores in the Ohio River Valley were so wide that entire hunting parties sheltered inside them through storms. One early 19th century surveyor, mapping a river bend in midwinter, recorded finding a fire's smoke rising not from chimney nor lodge, but from the living trunk of a tree, in which men were gathered as in the heart of a fort. There's something quietly extraordinary about that image. Not a house built against the forest, but a home made inside it. And yet, alongside the serious business of survival, there were moments of unexpected whimsy. One story, passed down in a few regional folktales, tells of two hunters who returned to a favorite hollow cedar one winter to find a raccoon had claimed it in their absence. Rather than drive it out, they supposedly built a small lean-to beside the tree, joking that they were the raccoon's guests for the season. Whether true or not, it captures something essential about these shelters. They were shared spaces, fluid and alive, not rigidly owned or imposed. As with much of the past, scholars continue to debate how central hollow tree sheltering truly was in day-to-day winter survival. Some maintain it was a widespread and foundational practice, integral to seasonal migration patterns and family life in wooded regions. Others argue it was situational, used when the opportunity presented itself, but not a dominant mode of winter habitation. The difficulty lies in evidence. Trees don't leave clear archaeological signatures. What remains are scattered references, oral histories, and the trees themselves, many of which are gone. But the debate itself reveals something beautiful, a shared desire to understand how deeply humans once moved, in step with the living world around them. You walk slowly toward one of the trees in the clearing, a massive, partially hollow oak, whose opening is wide enough for you to step inside. The interior smells faintly of earth and damp wood. Light filters down through a split high above, catching bits of swirling dust and making them glow like slow-falling embers. You press your palm to the inner wall, and it's cool, almost cold, but solid. You can picture the layers that might have once lined this space. Bark insulation, moss pressed into cracks, spruce boughs spread across the floor. Maybe an ember bed once glowed where your feet are now, its smoke drifting lazily upward into that crack of sky. You stand still and let your breathing match the quiet. It's not hard to imagine a family here centuries ago. The children curled near the back, the fire whispering low, someone telling a story in the half-light while wind clawed at the forest outside. These were not grand halls or monuments. They were humble, warm spaces carved into living wood, but in their simplicity lay a profound kind of resilience. These shelters required no blueprint, no nails, no imposed geometry. They relied on reading the land, listening to the forest, and moving with it rather than against it. The clearing around you is hushed now, but you can almost sense the ghosts of those winter nights. The glow of embers flickering through bark flaps, laughter mingling with the sound of snow settling on branches, a whispered greeting pressed into the wood before sleep. The trees are fewer now, and the tradition has faded from daily life, but its echo remains, not as a monument you can visit, but as a way of seeing the world differently. And so, as the light begins to fade again, you step out from the hollow and look back at the entrance. It's just a tree, and yet it isn't. It's a story still standing. The forest exhales softly, and the wind stirs for the first time since the storm, brushing snow from the branches, like a gentle curtain falling at the end of a long performance. This is where the journey settles, not in a grand conclusion, but in quiet recognition. For countless winters, people slept inside living trees. They lined their walls with bark, warmed their hands by ember beds, whispered dreams to the wood, and woke to the sound of snow cracking in the morning air. And even though the world has changed, those nights remain, tucked inside the trunks of memory like warmth held beneath ash, waiting for someone to listen. The forest darkens slowly, the hush deepening, until all that remains is the sound of your breath mingling with the winter air. The clearing fades, the trees stand, and the story rests patiently, like the embers of a fire that will never truly go out. And now, as the last echoes of this journey fade into the stillness of the night, let your shoulders loosen. Feel the weight of the story settle gently, like snow falling on quiet ground. The forest around you grows softer with every breath, the tall trees standing like ancient guardians against the dark. You can almost sense their slow heartbeat beneath the bark, the way they've watched centuries pass without hurry. Imagine yourself stepping back inside one of those hollow trees, not as a traveler braving the winter, but simply as someone seeking calm. The air inside is warm from a low ember bed, flickering softly, painting golden light along the bark walls. The wind outside is distant now, just a whisper against the entrance flap. You curl up on a bed of boughs, feeling the earth beneath you, the tree's curved walls holding you like a protective arm. Your breath mingles with the quiet. Each exhale softens the edges of thought, drawing you deeper into that timeless stillness. Above, the chimney slit lets in a single thread of starlight, faint and steady. You follow it upward with your mind, watching it vanish into the night sky. Whatever the day has carried, whatever waits for tomorrow, here, inside this imagined hollow, you are safe. The forest has closed around you like a lullaby. The ember bed hums softly. The walls are warm, and the night outside is no longer a threat but a companion. Let the rhythm of the trees guide you toward rest. Their patience is endless, their shelter enduring, their stories quiet but alive, and somewhere, in that silence, the last ember of the past glows softly, keeping the night warm.